The final boss of One Piece is here. His patience is limited, his powers are maximum, his pants are missing, but no one wants to be the one to tell him that for obvious reasons. Scopogaban and Nico Robin. Name a more dynamic duo. I'll not wait, because we have far too much to get into this week, including the now confirmed hidden history between Brook and Gunko, and also something that a lot of people may have overlooked in regards to Jarl, and why he was the one given the dilemma to decide Elbaf's future. But this chapter begins pretty hilariously by showing us a very classic group of Straw Hats captured together image, and I have to say that seeing Jinbei tied up with Usopp, Brook, and Nami is a bit surreal. It reminds me a lot of when Zoro got caught with Brook and Usopp in that teeny tiny cage on Fishman Island, which was a very similar situation actually, because Hody Jones caught them and then he made an announcement to the entire island, just like St. Summers is doing right now. Hody was even giving the island an ultimatum as well, which was to betray the humans or die. But Nami even mentions how odd it is that this happened with Jinbei here, although I'm honestly not sure if any of the monster trio would have helped out more in this position. Sanji would have been simping for Gunko and become powerless. Luffy always gets caught by a gimmick enemy during their first encounter, and so really the only hope would have been Zoro and his horrible sense of direction being somehow immune to Gunko's abilities. So I guess this is a bit of a rite of passage for Jinbei. Now that he's officially a Straw Hat, he's just gonna have to get used to getting captured every now and then for fun story reasons. Now, one very extremely exciting thing that happens in chapter 1147 is that we now have confirmation that Gunko knows exactly who Brook is, and under threat of Foot in Face, demands that he devote himself entirely to her. To which Brook refuses, proving that he is far stronger than the majority of the internet would have been in this exact same position. But this is another classic Brook moment, because he goes on to hype up his captain and states that he would rather embrace death than live without honor. But then something very weird happens with Gunko. She kicks Brook as punishment for him not wanting to become her music slave, and then we cut to this panel of Gunko grabbing her chest, which I think is meant to be Gunko grabbing her heart, because this is neither the time nor the place for grabbing other chest-related items, and the onomatopoeia being used here is Giyu, which is the sound of something being squeezed, hugged, or even crushed tightly. So whatever's happening here is some pretty serious pain, and it's just such a weird panel. And I guess my current reading of it is that it gave Gunko some actual genuine heartache to kick someone whose music she admires so much, or it could go a layer deeper than that, and we could be dealing with a pretty hardcore Brook stan. Gunko could be obsessed with Brook to an extraordinarily unhealthy level, and may have requested that he only make music for her as some sort of initiation of romance. I don't know if I'm thinking anywhere near along the right lines here, I could be way off. And maybe this whole situation is actually some sort of new ability from Brook, a brand of soul power that damages his opponents in proportion to the damage they deal to him, like some sort of destiny bond. That, or it has something to do with music itself. With Brook, his music does have tangible powers like playing a lullaby to send people to sleep, or even replicating Belo Betty's power, as on Namakura Island, Brook's music gave all of the cultists the courage and warrior spirit to stand up to the Long Arm tribe. So maybe there's something inbuilt into Brook's music that is affecting Gunko because of how frequently she listens to it. So yeah, not quite sure what's happening, but I am glad that we finally addressed this connection, and it looks like Brook knows who Gunko is as well. Because when he's tied up, he says, "That woman? No, it couldn't be." Couldn't be what, Brook? Who couldn't it be? Just go ahead and tell me who it couldn't be so I know the one person it can't be. And that, combined with what Saul was saying about the Holy Knights being immortal, I suppose implies that Brook knows Gunko from long ago. These two have some sort of history, and I'm really looking forward to diving a bit deeper into Brook's past. Meanwhile, Monkey D. Luffy, he's not in this chapter, but his presence is still very strongly felt, as neither St. Killingham nor St. Summers wish to risk antagonizing him. They both view Luffy in the same vein as starting a fight against Kaido, the biggest of mothers, the blackest of beards, or Shanks, him. And you would think that Gunko would be as well, given her fear of Nika, as well as the fact that she was the one who warned them not to start shit with Luffy a couple of chapters ago to begin with. If they were trying to avoid picking a fight with Luffy, then it must be said that they're doing a pretty terrible job. And they are so incredibly lucky that Luffy has a shiny new Loki friend to play with at the moment. However, it is pretty damn cool to see this level of respect for Luffy. He's only relatively recently gotten to the point where characters don't entirely disregard him as some sort of loud, violent rookie. And of all people, I would have expected the Holy Knights to still kind of hold that arrogant view of him. World nobles have such a clear sense of godlike superiority that it does pleasantly surprise me to hear that they're at least trying to be mildly careful about getting into a conflict with him, but again, they're doing a pretty terrible job of it. Meanwhile, Dory and Broggy also had a pretty hilarious stumble this week for two reasons. One is because in a previous chapter, it was said that their ship is unstoppable, and 3 chapters later, and it is now very much stopped. But what's even better is exactly what stopped it. The giant warrior pirates have been attacked by a group of mothers and wives, which are proving to be by far the scariest and most effective nightmares conjured on Elbaf. And even though these are not the mothers of the giant warrior pirates, I think it's some of their wives, which is pretty funny. But there does seem to be a shared culture of trauma on Elbaf regarding the fear of mothers. So even Dory and Broggy, who are laughing at every other nightmare imaginable, these world-ending creatures, that's not a problem. Funny. But these mothers, oh no, they are deeply affected by this. Which may have enlightened us to the true secret of Elbaf. As it turns out, it was never the giant warrior pirates, nor the army of giants who the world had to fear. No. It was the legion of mothers who raised those pirates and soldiers who have been the true threat all along. Because now the power of 2 mothers have brought down one of the most legendary pirate crews to have ever sailed the Grand Line. And what's funny is that Ripley sees that Sval has crashed and is completely gobsmacked at just how such a thing could have happened. Which nefarious villain could have possibly brought down a vessel full of warriors? And the answer to that question is technically her. She's a mother as well and is probably very familiar with wielding the motherly arts. And also one minor note about Ripley being the one to rush over to help is that Frankie and Lilith are with her. So if we do need to get the ship up and running again, then those are the 2 most perfect people in the entire world to not only do a quick repair, but even a quick upgrade. But a large part of this chapter is spent with St. Summers delivering a dilemma, which he has chosen to do in the most dramatic way possible to milk the dual teats of love and despair. St. Summers isn't just trying to get the Elbaf warriors on the side of the world government, which is his mission, but that's not enough for him. And instead, he's trying to do it in the most world noble way possible by having them abandon their values and assume an identity chosen for them by Summers. The world government need the giants, but they only need them for the fighting. And so all of these libraries and schools, they're an unnecessary complication to that. So Summers is giving the giants a choice: abandon yourselves or abandon your future, your children. And Oda spends 2 pages properly introducing us to the kids one by one, giving us a very short shot of each of their personalities. Some of them are frightened, some of them are optimistic, one is pretty sadly depressed. Some want to fight back, at least one of them is an orphan and is all like, well, at least you have parents. And one of them also appears to be a very selfish Road style character who's saying, just come save me at least, don't care about the others. So it's like within these 10 children, we have a perfect cross-section of Elbaf society. And some people may not care that so much time was spent on the kids, but I think it is very important to highlight them so that we know exactly what it is we're fighting for. And when it comes to this dilemma, exactly what we are being asked to choose between. I now care a lot more about, say, little Ronya because I love her Luffy-like optimism. I also care about Mug because he clearly wants to fight, but he just can't break free. And I also quite like Bent in general because he's the kid who this whole nightmare mother gag is centered around. But what this achieves is that we're not just trying to get invested in the sake of saving hypothetical children. We now know who each and every one of these kids are as an individual. They're no longer just drama props, and the idea of losing any one of them now is a pretty big emotional hit. But at the same time, we also know how heavy of a loss it would be to burn down the Owl Library to save them. And the man at the center of this choice is the absolute perfect character to saddle the dilemma with, being Jarl. Firstly, because one of the kids is his granddaughter, Ylva, so he already has very personal stakes in this. But secondly, because as the oldest living giant, he is the one who remembers and embodies the old Elbaf the most. The island of war that existed long before we built these schools and libraries and tried to do this peace thing. So in Jarl's position, the clear choice would be to save his granddaughter, and this is no doubt part of why Summers made the calculation to give Jarl this choice, to make extra sure that it results in the outcome that he wants, and for the Giants to revert to a culture of exclusively battle lust. This is going to show us how much value Jarl places in this new Elbaf, and there is no way that he is going to sacrifice any child, especially one of his descendanty childs, for schools and libraries, surely. But if Oda was to show us how painful it would be for Jarl to make this decision, then it would show how far Elbaf as a whole has become, for even Jarl to be a man who sees so much value in these new ways. Although ideally, it's not a choice that he's going to have to actually make if the last two characters shown in this chapter have anything to say about it, because the last page of this chapter was everything to me. For the entire time I've been reading One Piece, one of my most consistent complaints is not seeing Robin get enough decent action, and so the end of this chapter is extremely promising in that regard. So there were a lot of people in my comments for last week's videos making excuses for why Robin couldn't possibly fight Saint Summers. One that I heard quite a bit of was how bad of a matchup Robin's abilities were for Summers, since touching thorns traditionally results in big owies. But using that to say that Robin is a bad matchup for Summers is like saying that Luffy was a bad matchup against Don Krieg. I mean, what is a melee fighter like Luffy supposed to do against Don Krieg's cloak of spikes? Nothing. He can't do shit. Luffy's only option is to hide. There is no other solution. So look, I didn't care about all of that last week, and Robin doesn't care about any of it this week. And I think that Summers versus Robin is actually quite an interesting matchup thematically, because you've essentially got a clash of flowers versus thorns, nature versus nature. Robin's devil fruit is the Hana Hana no Mi, the flower fruit, and it is going up against the thorn fruit. So we've got the vivid beauty of life versus the more barren and cruel side of that beauty. And another reason why this could be pretty great is that Robin kicking into action flips the script on Saul. He did everything he could to protect her as a child, but now that Robin has grown and bloomed into this demonic hellflower, it is her turn to protect him. Which also ties into the title of the chapter, the things we find scary, or the things we're afraid of, or however it will be translated. Whatever it turns out to be, Robin is very afraid of losing Saul again, and also extremely afraid of a second Ohara incident happening on Elbaf. With Summers demanding that the Giants burn down the Owl Library, we are now approaching very scary burning of the Tree of Knowledge territory, especially since that Owl Library just so happens to contain all of the books that were saved from the Tree of Knowledge. So this isn't just any old fight for Robin. At the end of the chapter, she has gone and given one of the most serious Nico Robin faces in this series, because this isn't just about Saul, the Giants, the children, or even the Straw Hats. This is a fight to keep Ohara alive. Which, by the way, I'm gonna say it, not the best move by Ange to mention all of that out loud. As part of her plea to Summers to stop all of the bad things it is he's doing, Ange states that all of the secrets discovered by the Ohara scholars are being kept in the Owl Library. And surely if you're Saint Summers, then that just means you are going to make extra sure to burn it down. What's that you say? All of the secrets that could lead to my downfall are in that one very fire-vulnerable building? Thank you very much for telling me that unprompted. I swear, even if Ange isn't a traitor, she may as well be one. She's an honorary traitor, and she would be an absolute nightmare to play a hidden role game with. She is the sort of person who will always be on the good side, but still act as suspicious as possible. Still, Ange's words about Ohara do make this very personal for Robin, and I am loving this setup for her, which is why, as excited as I am about Mr. Scopogaban rushing in, I do hope that Robin does get to take a serious stand against Summers, because he is the one directly threatening everything of meaning to her. With that said, Robin could also end up fighting Gunko. She is also there. However, that's only if Brook doesn't end up being freed and sorts out his business with her. Gunko definitely feels more suited to Brook at the moment. They've got stuff to work out. But Robin could be an option while Scopogaban takes on Saint Summers, because he also has a very strong thematic claim to this fight, which I've flagged before. Saint Summers seems to have this large focus on love and twisting it for his entertainment, and Scopogaban is the self-proclaimed missionary of love, now on a mission to save his child who he assumedly loves. And this is exactly what Summers was talking about a couple of chapters ago. In 1143, he said that his most favorite part about this game was the parent-child dynamic. He went on this whole rant about hugging children tight and screaming and wailing, rah rah rah. And that's what we have here with Scopa Gaban rushing in to save his child Colin. Although one interesting thing about Gaban is that I can't see him as the typical kind of parent that Summers is thinking about, especially because in this chapter when Colin's name was mentioned as one of the kidnapped children, Gaban was quite proud of his son for thrusting himself straight into the apex of danger. So Scopa Gaban doesn't seem like an overly huggy kind of parent. He seems more like a brutally bludgeoned family enemies with a big axe kind of parent. And I have to say that as much as I do miss Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji, if we're getting some good Robin and Scopa Gaban out of it, then I am all in for that. And is there a chance that this all gets wrapped up without the monster trio, and the rest of the Straw Hats go on to prove their worth as the crew of an Emperor of the Sea? I don't know, I think I'm pretty skeptical about that, but at least taking them out of the picture for now is giving the rest of the crew some pivotal screen time that they don't usually see. And as for how long this will last, St. Summers did do an island-wide announcement in this chapter, and while we don't know whether or not this was heard all the way in the underworld, it may very well have been, which would let everyone down there know that they need to stop messing around, and I guess make a pretty big choice as to whether or not to fully free Loki. A choice which this time I imagine Haradin will play a role in making. I think that Luffy's done his damage, and from this point onwards, Loki's freedom may hinge on these two brothers working their crap out, meaning that the much anticipated Loki flashback could be incoming quite soon, especially because the history of Harold seems to be closely tied to the Holy Knights, and so we may need to explore and set that up before we go about satisfactorily defeating them. But you let me know your brain thoughts about the chapter in the comments below. The fact they say don't antagonize Luffy, and then immediately announce to the entire island that they are holding the children hostage to threaten the giants into obeying the world government, leads me to believe that they don't know Luffy's personality. I think that makes sense because the world government have a very twisted perspective on Luffy. As a wielder of a mighty D, they genuinely believe that he is a demon, and as a result of their own propaganda, I should say, they've painted Luffy as an incredibly unsympathetic, ruthless, vicious villain, and it's very dangerous to start believing your own propaganda. But they think that as long as they don't directly attack Luffy or the Straw Hats, which they are, but as long as they don't, which they're not, then Luffy's not going to care about some child murder happening all the way over there. Honestly, the biggest problem that the Holy Knights have isn't the child threatening, it's the fact that the giants have fed Luffy. And more so than anything else, Luffy will fight to the death for anyone who feeds him, which is something that the world noble mind will never be able to understand. Because them being fed is an expectation, it is a necessary service being provided to the mighty beings that are gods, and in fact we've even seen world nobles shoot their chefs for serving them the wrong kind of food. There's just such a huge disconnect from humanity happening here, and I would bet that the Holy Knights would probably feel the same way about any emperor. And to be fair, in the case of Kaido, Blackbeard, and maybe Buggy, they'd probably be correct. With Shanks, they might think he's less likely to save random kids because he has world noble blood, so he of all people should understand. Although with Whitebeard, they would be way off and walk right into a quake in the nutsack. However, very surprisingly, also Big Mom. She gets incredibly defensive whenever any child is being threatened. And that's probably one of my most startling realizations of all during this arc, that Charlotte Lin Lin possesses more humanity than the Holy Knights. What's worse than Big Mom? Even bigger moms. Yes, it's true. It feels like the giants can handle pretty much everything except for large maternal figures. They see Jormungandr, they see a Loki, lots of Draugrs, of Fenrir, and all of these other world-ending creatures, but the only ones that are actually effective against the giants are the Big Mothers. So Big Mom continues to spiritually be the bane of the giants, and this does tie very strongly into something that Oda said long ago. In the SBS of volume 78, Oda was asked the following question: why is it that there is an abnormally extensive number of characters in One Piece who have unknown or already deceased mothers? And to this, Mr. Eiichiro Oda replied, I see. Well, the answer is simple. That's because mother is the antonym for adventure, which is basically Oda's way of saying it's hard to create a fun story if you've got a mother involved. So in a way, mothers are the scariest possible thing for Luffy, because their care and protection would stop him from going on all of those fun but dangerous adventures. 110%. Brook's words just reached Gunko and hit her hard. Alright, so the more I look back on Gunko grabbing her chest, the more I am convinced that this is a very Eiichiro Oda portrayal of love. It's very similar to when Boa Hancock grabs her chest whenever she's thinking about Luffy, especially when she initially came down with the love sickness. And in chapter 1143, Mr. St. Summers said something that I overlooked at the time, but may be becoming very relevant now. After his speech about love, Summers calls Gunko the quote, woman who never knew love, because she had no reaction to his game, the theory behind it, or the feeling it was that he was trying to produce. So in this moment with Brook, Gunko may be feeling love for the very first time. And it hurts her not only to kick Brook, but to be rejected by Brook. Except she doesn't understand why. She has no idea what is happening. Ah, my heart, what is this, the work of an enemy stand? And so her expression of affection is demanding that Brook become her music slave, which she probably sees as quite reasonable, even generous, and dare I say, flirtatious. And maybe she'll go on to be continuously rejected by Brook in various hilarious ways. Like say Brook saying he'd be happy to give her his heart, but he has no heart to give. Yo! It does slightly worry me though. I'm a bit afraid of Gunko potentially becoming another Boa Hancock. Her obsession with Luffy is one of my least favorite character quirks in the series. I mean, it's definitely funny at times, but I think it often goes a bit too overboard and makes Hancock very one note. It overtakes a lot of the other stuff I love about her, like looking so far down that she's looking up and also kicking baby seals. So that's the one concern I would have if Gunko were to go down this path as well. I hope that she doesn't go full simp. But I've also seen the idea floated around that Gunko may have been the princess of the kingdom that Brook previously served as the head of their military. In which case, maybe the world nobles did use Brook's Island for a native hunting contest, abducting the princess in the process, and this could be some sort of long-awaited reunion. The only reason why I take the time to pose that idea is because it's hard to ignore any potential for princesses. Oda loves a good princess story. And the other main idea I've seen is that Gunko is Calico Yorkie's daughter, which I'm not a big fan of at the moment, so princess it is. Or even better, it could just be a straight up gag. Like Oda's setting us up for some sort of deep history between Brook and Gunko. Ooh, what happened in the back thens? But as it turns out, he just recognizes her as Groupie from one of his concerts, a very overly active fan who may or may not have a Brook body pillow. We don't know, but probably. Maybe Brook's line was disbelief that Gunko was in panties and not because he recognized Gunko. Alright, I see what you're getting at here. So in that case, the line would more accurately be, that woman? No, couldn't be. I can already see her panties. What do I ask for now? I'm calling it now, in a way that can only be described as somehow, Gunko is the female priest from the island Brook got warped to during the time skip. The summoning circle, the obsession with Brook, the willingness to show panties, it all fits. So in defense of this idea, this woman was never named, and I guess she does play a pretty core role in Brook's side story, because she gets kidnapped by the Long-Arm tribe, then Brook writes music to inspire everyone to get her back, and after Brook gets kidnapped, we never see her again. In fact, I don't think we see the residents of Namakura Island again at all. At least not in the manga. Maybe they did something fillery in the anime. But Brook's 2-year time skip was pretty much all spent with the Long-Arm tribe, and so these cultists are one of the few groups that we haven't checked in with post-time skip, which may or may not be relevant because they happen to worship the same sort of pentagram symbols, not necessarily the same symbol, but the same sort that the Holy Knights used to travel, which we now know is a system called the Abyss. I do think it would be a big stretch for Gunko to have been the priestess, but it's not the absolute most craziest thing I've ever heard, I guess, just because of that potential connection of that island to the Abyss. Robin's look in her eye was so intimidating and fierce, makes me wonder if maybe a Haki awakening is around the corner. If it doesn't happen now, then I'm not sure if it ever will. People are probably sick of me bringing this up, but it continues to be ever so relevant. But both Robin and Frankie are not Haki users, at least not that we've seen. However, both of them were able to beat highly skilled Haki users during the raid on Onigashima, which felt a bit wrong to me at the time and still a bit wrong to me at the now, and I'm really not sure why Oda's holding out on us with this. Every Straw Hat definitely has the willpower necessary to become a Haki user, but for whatever reason, he just refuses to give it to a lot of the crew. Namely Frankie, Robin, Nami, Chopper, and Brook, half the crew. And while I'm not sure if he ever will, this would be a pretty great time to unlock Robin at the very least, because she is fighting for the whole of Ohara right now. There's not going to be many greater chances that Robin gets to flex that sweet, sweet willpower. I will say I was sort of right about the reason Soul made Robin hide, because he knew he was a Holy Knight and was unkillable. It would be a war of attrition that Robin would badly lose. Maybe, but there is still the greater logical issue. Sol says to hide so that they can have an opportunity to save the kids. But that opportunity doesn't exist unless they either defeat, distract, or somehow incapacitate Summers. So immortal or not, there's still no real choice except to fight Summers because, look, just because you're immortal doesn't make you unbeatable. We defeat people in One Piece all the time without killing them. Although I do understand why Sol said this because he probably still sees Robin as the little girl that he met on Ohara, but she has grown so much since then, and it is definitely time to showcase that for him. People need to stop putting valuable texts in very flammable trees. Oh, agreed. I know we've lost a lot of technology from the days of the Void Century, but I think it's time that we started to research into how to build fireproof libraries. Sol's comment about immortality rubs me the wrong way, or at least I need an explanation, and a good one at that, of why Garling became an old man if the God Knights don't age. So to be fair here, immortality might not be the correct word. We'll need to say what he says with the official translation to confirm this, because the correct translation may be something more along the lines of unkillable or invulnerable. But Garling having aged is a very, very good point to bring up, because we know that the Five Elders haven't physically aged in at least 200 years. So if the Holy Knights are granted those same abilities, as Sol seems to imply, then why did Vigilant Garling age? And if the Holy Knights do age normally, then Brook probably doesn't know Gunko from way back when, and she would instead be a much more recent addition to his life, which adds to the groupie theory. This could be big news for Pudding. If the library and maybe even the Harley text is burnt down, then it may still be possible for Pudding with her memory powers to pull the information out of the heads of people who have already seen them, Vegapunk, Owl, or Frankie, and show them to others. It may very well be, and something that I'm not sure if we ever saw with Pudding's ability was the idea of splicing memories. Like we saw her extract, we saw her cut out memories and even insert false memories, but I wonder if she could take a person's real memories and insert them into another. So like Frankie sees the mural, right? Could she take Frankie's memories and put them into Robin's head? If so, Frankie and Lilith are pretty great candidates for that because they have near perfect memories, and in Frankie's case, that could also be how another Pluton gets built if they ever need it, because he's read and memorized the plans for it. So even if all is lost on Elbaf, I guess all is not necessarily lost. Only 9 kids for a whole elementary school? It really doesn't feel like much. Do giants have a hard time procreating? Look, I myself grew up in a major city, but I have a lot of friends who grew up in much more rural areas, which is how I would describe the villages of Elbaf. Each of them has their own school. And for those friends, 9 kids was a pretty big class. The little girl without parents is the only child ancient giant with natural horns. She probably lost her parents during the battle in the castle. That is a bit of a morbid and probably true thought, actually. The commenter is speaking about Joanna. She was the child who said, at least you have parents, and given that she does have these very natural looking horns, I now have a pretty dreadful feeling that her parents may have been killed by Harold's rampage because they had horns, with the current theory being that he was trying to cleanse Elbaf of the ancient giant bloodline, or at least the ancient giant aesthetics, which I guess may even be in a twisted way to save Elbaf from coming under the dominion of the world government. Very much the right idea, wrong implementation. Very wrong. However, Joanna may not be the only child here with natural horns. She's just the only one where they're obvious. There are a couple of others who might have horns like Skadi, but you know, it's not a great sign that the only confirmed orphan here also happens to be the only confirmed part ancient giant. It's not a good look, to say the very least, which is exactly what King Harold thought when he tore off his own horns. So there might be a darker story to explore here with Joanna, and who knows how many other kids who lost their parents during the battle at Oris Castle. You can also tell that Jinbei is rattled by getting dealt with so easily since he stopped speaking politely to Nami and basically tells her to shut up. I agree. If you look at Jinbei, he is so annoyed with what's just happened. And he's very snappy like, shut up, Nami, trying to use my shark brain to think of a way out of this. He's clearly gotten far, far too comfortable with being a warlord of the sea, where this sort of thing doesn't happen unless you refuse to fight for the world government and get imprisoned and impelled down, then it happens. But now that Jinbei's a straw hat, he's going to need to accept all sorts of strange things happening to a man of his status, because that's just what comes as part of being with this crew. Summers could always bring up Lola to Loki, reminding him of the pain of love. Look, love is definitely becoming a much bigger theme on Elbaf than I ever would have thought it would be, because you're right, Loki has history with love, painful history that I'm sure that Summers would love to exploit for his entertainment. Although that's only if Summers is up to the task of antagonizing Loki. After not wanting to engage with Luffy, I would think that deciding to prod Loki would also be quite unwise, unless Summers rather arrogantly thinks he's doing so while Loki's still chained up. But then then it turns out that he's been freed, and Summers gets a nice big smack on the butt with Ragnar. Mr. Internet Man, how the heck did Saul know Summers was a member of the Gods Knights? Where did he see him before? Is this a continuation of the Nobody Knows CP9? Yet everybody was shocked when the incredible Rob Lucci lost. Yeah, as much as I love the Water 7 Any Sloppy era, that aspect doesn't make a lot of sense in retrospect. The idea that CP9 was a secret, unknown cell, but everyone around the world knew Rob Lucci's name, and not only that, but it was the exact same name that he was using to infiltrate Galila, and it's like, mate, at least choose an alias. Become Lob Rucci or something. With the Holy Knights, though, I don't think they're a secret organization. They've definitely been unknown to us as readers for decades, but that's because we experience One Piece through the lens of Luffy. We only usually learn things as he does. I'd have to assume that the Holy Knights are pretty well known, and that as a former Vice Admiral, Saul would have crossed paths with them before. It's not like we're talking about Emu here. These guys are probably quite decently public figures. What intrigues me more is what Saul says about them being immortal, because that implies that he's seen their abilities before. And I'd love to know exactly where and why. One opportunity for that may be the God Valley incident. Saul is a very old giantman and could have been a marine dispatched to God Valley, where the Holy Knights were well and truly active. Not sure if it's a hot take, but the Elbaf kids feel like design personality mirrors to the Straw Hats. Feels like we just got a preview of Colin's new crew for the 2-piece sequel manga. Right, I'm not sure how much I buy into this idea right now, but it is quite compelling because a lot of the kids do seem to take inspiration from the Straw Hats, either aesthetically or in terms of personality. There's exactly 10 of them, and they're quite easily assigned. Colin as Luffy is something I've already been sold on, since seeing Colin doing the Nika pose in a previous chapter. And there's a lot of easy visual similarities to point out, like Colleen's nose with Usopp, Bjorn's hair with Sanji, and Joanna with pretty much Robin's entire face. There's only one that I'm not really sure of at the moment, and that would be Bent. In this theory, he's supposed to be the Brook character, and I really can't see that in him. If anything, he looks more like Scratchman Apu did as a child. But Bent aside, there's too many other similarities with the rest to ignore. And I really do like the idea that these 10 kids are going to become the Colin Pirates and take on the future of Elbaf. Maybe Gunko's pain is related to Summer's presence at the scene and kicking the one you love. Right, that is kind of interesting. Summer's whole deal here is to exploit love and to prompt touching, which prompts pain, lots and lots of pain. And the second that Gunko touches Brook, we've got ourselves, oh no, some pain. It's not the same kind, so if this was true, then it would be a more abstract use of Summers' devil fruit, but it could also just be the natural manifestation of what Summers is trying to artificially create. Just, I guess, the opposite way around. Summers is creating pain by trying to embrace those who you love, and this is causing Gunko pain by pushing away the one you love. I really hope we get to see Luffy's nightmare. I also really hope that it's a giant angry Nami. Well, it would only be one of two things, either Nami or Garp. Those are the only two people who Eiichiro Oda has confirmed can bypass Luffy's abilities and inflict serious damage. Garp through his fists of love, not Haki, it's the power of love, and Nami through her comical anger. And so, in a way, she will always be canonically stronger than Luffy, but only in certain situations. And if his nightmare did manifest as Nami, then I would love to see the real Nami's reaction, because I bet that it would be even scarier than the nightmare. We need to talk about the current state of the Elbaf arc, because we are now 21 chapters into our giant adventure, which is more than enough to form an opinion, and your opinions are quite different to what I expected. In terms of general Elbafian sentiment, I took a poll of all of you wondrous people, and the vast majority of you currently feel like the Elbaf arc is pretty good. That's the 60% opinion, whilst almost 35% are in love with the arc at really good, and a combined 6% aren't quite feeling it. Those lower percentages are about standard. I take these sorts of polls a lot because it's my favorite feature of YouTube. I love knowing how you guys feel en masse about certain things. And the negative numbers aren't surprising. When I did the Gear 5th poll, the people feeling negative about that were about the same, 6-7%. However, it's the positive numbers in this poll that are quite unusual for One Piece. Whenever I've done these in the past for Egghead and Wano, the most positive opinion has always been the majority response. So the fact that we are sitting so firmly in the realm of just, pretty good does does demonstrate to me that Elbaf hasn't quite captured people in the same way as previous arcs have. There has been what I would describe as a mild dip in interest, or maybe not interest, maybe the more accurate word is investment. And I feel like most One Piece YouTubers can agree with that. The reason for that being is because during this period, views have been falling across the board for One Piece YouTube channels, and part of that is going to be because the anime took a 6-month break, and so a lot of casual fans who only watched the anime ended up taking a break from the extended media. But I do also believe that part of that is this slight bump down in Elbaf investment. Because if you're going to go out of your way to watch a video on a thing, it's not going to be a thing that you feel neutral towards. You need some investment in that topic. However, to be clear, we still have approximately, and this is pretty stunning, but approximately 95% of people feeling that Elbaf is either pretty good or really good, which is a colossal positive. We're mostly enjoying our time on this island, just perhaps not as much as, say, other islands like Egghead. The general consensus seems to be best summarized by the following comment. I'm definitely enjoying this arc, but I can't stop thinking about how much fun Egghead was. And that's right, because Elbaf is a very standard One Piece arc compared to Egghead Island. Almost every One Piece arc starts off feeling a bit slow when reading week to week, because exploring the new and wacky islands, it's fun and everything, but it does take a while to put all of these pieces together to build the story of the arc, with the exception of Egghead. Because as soon as we arrived, this was a matter of global urgency. There was Vegapunks, there was Bonnie, there was Cypherpole, there was an Emperor of the Sea. Stuff was going down. Oda did not restrain himself in any way. And by this point on Egghead Island, we'd also had quite a few cuts to the outside world with stuff like Shanks versus Kid, Blackbeard versus Law, Garp heading to Hachinosu, and Sabo returning from the Reverie. So much of that stuff happened weirdly early on during Egghead, and at times it felt almost like what the Straw Hats were doing was the side story. And Elbaf has none of that. We are purely focused on the island at the moment, so it is a bit like coming down from a high and resuming everyday life and letting an arc play out as most standard One Piece stories do. There are three, count them, three things that I think Elbaf has nailed, absolutely nailed, and have instantly become a part of essential and iconic One Piece history. But there's also two pretty big things that I think Elbaf has really fumbled so far, and also a series of elements that could go either way. But we are going to start with the amazing, and that takes us to Loki was such an unexpected find for me. I immediately fell in love with his design and charisma. He is this weird mix of Dofi and Luffy. Weird, expected, but quite endearing and unique combination of character traits. Can't wait to see his backstory with Harold, his abilities, and overall role in the story. That is a brilliant comment that mostly summarizes my feelings as well. I wasn't expecting too much from Loki based on his silhouette that we'd seen. In my mind, he was either going to be a Spandam or Orochi-style tricksy villain with minimal substance, or a more Momonosuke-like prince character that we needed to help. But Oda did what Oda do, and he put all of the aura made from last year's bountiful aura harvesting into this one single character. Because Loki, he's kind of everything right now. I definitely agree with the comment on his design, but it's not just a mix of Luffy and Doflamingo. No, there is also a distinct hint of Charlotte Katakuri incorporated in there, at least aesthetically. And you can tell that Mad, a story scientist at Eiichiro Oda, engineered Loki to be as cool and as intimidating as possible, but also with an element of likability. So he took a lot of traits from other characters and slapped them into this super character. Loki's introduction was definitely the first moment on Elbaf that really blew me away. The thing that made me sit up and go, all right, we've got something here, which I feel was very necessary after the adventures in Legoland. And at the moment, the best part of Loki for me is his potential. There's still a big question mark over whether he'll be an ally or an enemy, or maybe even a mix of both, but I don't particularly care either way, because both directions hold a pretty incredible amount of potential, and I am mentally salivating at the promise of seeing Loki in a full-scale fight, because you just know that he is going to absolutely eviscerate whoever's unlucky enough to go up against him first. Friend or foe, doesn't matter, you are getting thwacked with a hammer. Loki's been chained up for so long, and Oda will need to give him that kind of showcase for Loki to live up to the legend that's been created around him. And Loki's also very directly tied to pretty much every major plot line or point of intrigue on Elbaf. There's still the mystery of his devil fruit to solve, the legendary devil fruit, as well as the story of King Harold, the story of Harudin. Loki is integral to all of this, and without Loki, we pretty rapidly run out of questions to ask. And that's why I do also understand the sentiment that Elbaf is just pretty good at times, because there's a lot of chapters without Loki, and given that he is the key to almost every interesting plot point on the island, I guess it can feel a bit like we're not moving forward during certain weeks that are purely, say, Holy Knight focused. Although I think that's just an even greater credit to the character that Oda's built. Loki commands such presence that we're left a bit Loki hungry whenever he's not in a chapter. But he's definitely not the only crowning element of Elbaf. The mural alone has propelled Elbaf into one of my favorite arcs. The mural, mate, the mural. That was the bombshell that this arc really needed. Loki, he was a great start, but this is the scale of lore drop that Egghead left us craving. And I know that I'm comparing Elbaf to Egghead a lot, and I'll probably continue to, but that's because Egghead Island set a certain standard. That was Oda's introduction to the final saga of One Piece, and it came with so many old world lore revelations that this is now the standard for all arcs going forward. However many of them there may be left, and there may not be all that many, but we are really amping up the history and coming close to legitimately solving these mysteries which have been set up for decades, which is why this mural was such a welcome and generous gift. Because it took something set up on Egghead and expanded it like a big bang, giving birth to a whole new universe that we were unaware of before. And now we have a full picture, albeit a very cryptic full picture, of not only the past but also potentially the future of One Piece. So we've got one amazingly cool and compelling character, as well as one mind-blowing lore drop. So my third highlight so far is a nice moment of emotion. My favorite was Robin cutting her hair to make it look like the first time we met her, and her meeting up with Soul was super touching. It's kind of funny because in recent chapter reviews I've been talking about Soul treating Robin like the little girl he met 22 years ago. But at the same time, Robin did go out of her way to look more familiar to him by reclaiming that old hairstyle. But the amount that I loved the reunion of Robin and Soul is something that really surprised me and did change my opinion somewhat on fake out deaths in One Piece, because this situation did show, at least to me, that they can be done well, and it's just that throughout the history of One Piece they really haven't been before now. I have a whole video elsewhere on this channel if you're interested in that. It examines in a painful amount of detail why Soul worked and nothing else has, using fictional facts and fictional logic. But this is the sort of thing that I really wanted from Elbaf. Not necessarily this specific reunion, but Elbaf is something that we've been, theoretically, working towards ever since Little Garden, and it very much warrants these hard emotional payoffs as a reward for finally making it this far. And in the case of Robin, this is her reward for managing to survive the last 2 decades, dereshishing herself to this point of reunion. So it was really well done and extremely satisfying for me. As another positive, I'd also like to give an honorable shout out to Scopper Gaban. It's very nice to finally have him in the picture, although everything we've gotten to see of him so far is still a bit of a tease, and I'm looking forward to hopefully getting into him a bit more in terms of both action and some Roger lore. But as mentioned before, there have also been a mighty 2 things that have been quite questionable for me. The first of which being, I really didn't like the very start with the kidnapping and Lego Castle, so I made a 3 months break. That's fair enough. I'm pretty sure that Oda also took some pretty big breaks around that time, so you're not alone. At the very least, during that time, we all took about a month's break. But I do agree that this was quite a weak start to an arc by One Piece standards. The Lego stuff was pretty wild at the time, although not intentionally, because this was the series of chapters that had me and many others convinced that something really sinister and tricksy was going on here because of all of the art errors like Luffy's changing weapon, his vanishing straw hat, and all of the other stuff, which was revealed to just be an uncharacteristic amount of legitimate art errors that were not caught, which have all now been fixed in the volume release. It's crazy that it ever got to that stage to begin with though. But without all of that stuff to dive into, because those art errors were really our main focus of the Lego time, without all of that stuff, I get it. By One Piece arc standards, it was not a strong start. It was a cute little adventure in Legoland, but it did feel a bit more like the premise of a filler arc. And I think we now know why that is. We didn't know this at the time, but One Piece now has an official collaboration with Lego, which Oda himself said was a dream fulfilled for him, that he'd been asking for One Piece Lego ever since the anime first came out. So my guess is that this whole Legoland on Elbaf section was inspired by that deal, and that Elbaf would have opened a different way had it not existed, but it was Oda's desire to work with Lego that made him think, oh, can we fit this in somewhere? And so that led to the crew getting drunk on Green Ferry and then abducted and then Lego. That or it was meant to be a straight up planned promotion of the One Piece Lego sets. Just that the timing was a bit off. Like when Eiichiro Oda stated that he ended Wano quickly in order to get Shanks to appear just in time for the release of Film Red as a bit of manga promotion. So the One Piece manga is unfortunately not immune from the story changing to fit auxiliary marketing needs. And while I have no proof that this is what happened with Lego, unlike what happened with Film Red, it does feel like a strong possibility. Either way, I really do wonder how Elbaf would have started if this collaboration had not existed. It probably would have felt a bit more natural and engaging, but then there's also this. I think the only questionable move Oda has made so far was introducing Shamrock just to remove him from the arc, but we'll have to wait and see. Yes, we will have to wait and see. Look, there's still potential, but as it is right now, I really kind of struggle to define Shamrock for the sake of this discussion, because look, he is definitely a highlight. When he strolled in, it was like, whoa. But also, after he strolled right the F back out, he's become a bit of a low point for me. Introducing Figgle and Shamrock gave Elbaf that relentless Egghead feeling, where we were being bombarded by massive world elements coming together to clash gloriously. And then removing him by sending Shamrock back to Marijois felt like abruptly hitting the brakes. It is the biggest narrative cock tease in One Piece history to have this man set foot on the island and then just Grandpa Simpson his way right back out again. So before I said that we were theoretically building to Elbaf ever since Little Garden, and the reason why I use the word theoretically is because Eiichiro Oda has come out and said that he wasn't originally planning on doing an Elbaf arc. And I know a lot of people don't believe me when I say this, but those are his words. I've got a video on it if you want to watch it. But the point of bringing this up is that it could explain Shamrock. That maybe the intention for Shamrock is to be explored later down the line, but this somewhat improvised Elbaf arc needed an extra jolt of excitement, and so we got a taste of him here. And now Shamrock has left the other Holy Knights with the impossible task of living up to him. With that said, again, it may still be too early to judge this, and Shamrock may become involved in Elbaf again, but right now, yeah, I'm not the biggest fan of the Shamrock tease. Especially because it has put so much heavy lifting onto the poor shoulders of the rest of the Holy Knights. I'm still not sold on the villains yet. The Holy Knights feel like much less of a threat after just coming off the 5 Elders on Egghead. So I am personally slowly coming around to the Holy Knights, but I definitely share the same concern. It's really hard to take them seriously as the main antagonist after just having fought against the 5 Elders. It definitely feels like a step down in the hierarchy, which it is, and that's why I'm hoping that these Holy Knights are just an Elbafian entree. Sort of like how Rob Lucci and the Seraphim were our opening shot of Egghead. Just a bit of fun opening to mid-level action before the truly serious stuff kicks in. Because each of the 3 Holy Knights left on Elbaf have a lot of potential to be fun side characters. The 3 of them would all work quite well as accessories for a more serious antagonist. For example, I'm really enjoying the theme of Saint Summers with his focus on exploring love in its most tragic forms, but I'm not sure if he's equipped to take on the role of primary antagonist at this stage in One Piece. We are just too deep into this series, too deep into this world to have this guy be a whole crew problem. Not just a whole crew problem, a whole island problem. Which is why I'm still holding out hope that Loki, Shamrock, or maybe even someone else is gonna step in and take control. But we'll have to wait and see. That's up in the air right now. And the second thing that could go either way is, I'm disappointed that Usopp hasn't had his character building moment, but I guess there's still time. There's definitely still time. We're quite early on in Elbaf, so I wouldn't have expected Usopp to have his moment by now, if it is gonna happen, because I'm not sure how much of this is just headcanon from, quite frankly, people like me. But at the same time, Elbaf is much more important to Usopp than any other member of the crew, even Robin. Elbaf ended up being important to her more or less incidentally, because that's where all her books and Giant went. So if we do leave without Usopp doing something or gaining something from the island, then that would be a shame. But again, it is way too early to be judging that sort of thing. I'm not sure if that moment's gonna come. However, to be completely fair to Usopp, I never would have thought that this arc was going to have as much Brook focus as we've had, and that's only really become a thing in the past couple of chapters. We're still very much in that introductory period and still establishing what the story threads are, so there's still room for Usopp here to develop a little something. Although Elbaf is a little bit more difficult to pinpoint in terms of exactly where we are in the One Piece arc lifecycle. We're currently 21 chapters in, meaning that we've confirmed that this is not a small Zou-length arc, because that was only 23 chapters and it was pretty much wrapped up by now, which leaves us with two options. Elbaf is either going to be a mid-range classic One Piece arc, or it's going to be a mega arc. Mid-range stuff is along the lines of Fishman Island and Punk Hazard, which both sat at about the 50 chapter mark. And at this point in both of those arcs, we were sitting in the turn, which is a point in the fun adventure where we take a dark turn. After which point the crew regroup for a final victorious assault. That point in Fishman Island was Otohime and Fisher Tiger's flashback, and on Punk Hazard it was after Luffy lost to Caesar and they were imprisoned, both of which were happening at about this point. I would say that reaching that point on Elbaf is probably going to be the Loki flashback to create that dramatic crater that we need to rise up and conquer, but I honestly don't know how close we are to that yet. I just know that we're not quite there, so Elbaf is currently on a slower pace than Fishman Island and Punk Hazard, and I'd say it's currently more on pace with Egghead and Whole Cake Island sized arcs, which were 68 and 78 chapters respectively, and at this point in Whole Cake Island we were still handling those introductory elements. So Elbaf lines up with that, and Egghead, it's a bit of a weird one, because 21 chapters in we were at the turn, sort of. At this point York had just been revealed at the traitor the Seraphim had all turned on us, and we were at our lowest. However, it was also at this point that Oda decided to change the traditional arc structure, skipping all of that, and he did a different story instead, which reset the arc structure and moved the position of the turn to become Kuma's flashback later on. The only thing I can say right now is that I don't feel like Elbaf is going to be Wano or Dressrosa length. By this point in both of those arcs, we'd barely gotten anywhere. Act 1 of Wano had just finished, and Dressrosa, we were still mucking around in the Colosseum. So going by past standards, I'd say that we're a third or a quarter of the way through Elbaf, unless Oda decides to pull another Egghead Island and suddenly throw us all onto Marijois through a funky abyss circle or something. But my favorite piece of Elbaf feedback is the following. This is the first arc I've been reading from the start, and I love it. And I'm glad you love it. But here is something absolutely wild. I've been running this channel for about 10 years now, and Elbaf is only the third arc that it will be covering from beginning to end. I started in early Whole Cake Island, and then Wano took up most of this channel's life with over 4 years of publication, and even Egghead took 2 and a bit years. So with all of the everything it is I've just said, I'm definitely still loving Elbaf, and I'm looking forward to covering it for however long Eiichiro Oda chooses to bless us with it. But you let me know what you feel about Elbaf in the comments below. The left arm of the Pirate King is officially angry, and it has ended up costing the left arm of Saint Summers, which is canonically the only arm that One Piece characters are allowed to lose. Shanks lost his left arm, Eustace Kid lost his left arm, as did Basil Hawkins, as did Kiku, and even one of Nami's original designs featured her having lost most of her left arm. Being a left arm in One Piece dooms you to an even worse fate than being a mother, but we hop into the pretty big conundrum set up by Saint Summers pretty immediately in this chapter, and I think that Oda has done a really fantastic job of setting up this choice and hammering in exactly what it is that Summers is asking for. What we're doing is basically weighing up the sum of human and giant knowledge and history and culture against the life of a child. We are being asked to choose between the past and the future. We either need to lose who we were or lose what we will become. And in that respect, there's not really much of a choice to be made. Yes, you can choose to sacrifice the child to preserve your history and your culture, but in that case, who are you preserving it for? And so Jarl's decision actually makes a painful amount of sense, but then there is Ronya, the little star of this chapter, who has a very different solution to this problem. But before that, we have this nice little section of the Straw Hats having been tied up, which is traditionally a position of tip-top banter. Although in this case, Nami says something kind of interesting about how not even the worst people in this world use children as hostages, to which I have to respectfully disagree. As even all the way back in chapter 1 of One Piece, Higame used child Luffy as a hostage, and it's actually been a fairly common tactic for fictional ne'er-do-wells ever since. I'd also just like to take a moment to point out Brook in this group shot. Everyone else is tied up, but he is, well, he's especially tied up, real tight. Gunko seems to have had a much larger focus on making sure that Brook stays restrained, and it's pretty great because it makes him look like a mummy, which is hitting some nice Brook potential that I feel like we don't explore anywhere near enough. Back on Wano, in order to blend in, Brook had to dress up like a traditional Japanese ghost, which I loved, and I am always keen to see more classic horror from Brook. And in one panel, it also looks like Gunko has very conveniently sealed Brook's mouth shut, no doubt because she can't handle any more words of rejection or insolence from him. But it is again very convenient because at the moment, Brook can't monologue about exactly who he thinks Gunko may be. be, or at the very least who he thinks she definitely is not, according to him, or any of the other things that he may happen to know about the Holy Knights. But while we wait for that, a big highlight of this chapter for me was obviously Robin versus Saint Summers. Oh mate, it was brief but fantastic, that's what she said, etc. But mate, that very first hit on Saint Summers was drawn in such an incredibly powerful way. And I think that this hits me particularly hard because it is drawn very similarly to when Vice Admiral Doberman was attacked by Saint Saturn at the end of Egghead Island. It's that feeling of a force so overwhelming, and I love the choreography of the head being flung back with the rest of the body forced to follow. It's a fantastic smack in the crack, one which Summers really should take more care to avoid, but I guess that caring about what your opponent does wasn't really part of Holy Knight training. And to think that Robin, our Robin, is getting in a hit this powerful on a Holy Knight without Haki, that is pretty telling of the raw strength that she is capable of. Although I think what's happening here is a bit deceptive. It's not like Robin could just thwack a dude and this would be the result. Robin is using Cian Fleur, which is a root technique that she uses for a lot of different abilities. It literally means 100 arms, and I don't know if she uses exactly 100 arms every time, but at the very least it means lots and lots of arms, and Robin has used Cian Fleur to do stuff like make wings, make nets, and even make the big old tree that she used to protect Rebecca against Diamante. Interestingly though, she almost never uses Cian Fleur as a direct attack, or at the very least I can't find much evidence of it outside of this one sort of cleanup attack she used on Marines during Enies Lobby. So thematically, that is a pretty big deal. Robin using this attack means that she has absolutely run out of patience, and she is prepared to rip Saint Summers to pieces. And what I love is seeing the panel of Robin constructing this giant arm to attack Summers with, which is important to dwell on because in the actual attack page, I don't think it necessarily does a great job of displaying the sheer scale of the arm that Summers is being attacked by. But essentially, Robin is smacking him down with the concentrated power of 100 arms, and assumedly she's also baking in the principles of Fisherman Karate into this attack, because she learned some of that during her 2 years with the Revolutionary Army, and what we are seeing is a nice open palm strike. And I don't believe we've seen this attack before. It's named after the Crispedia flower, which are actually native to Australia, so g'day mates. And because they're Australian, I am obliged to inform you that we also call them Billy Buttons, because that's just what we do. And according to the internet, they symbolize wholeness, unity, and completeness, which makes a lot of sense because this Cian Fleur attack is rather uncharacteristically joining all of the 100 hands together to create a single unified hand. I should also point out that Cian Fleur was used to roll Yama off the cliff during Skypiea, so I guess that is another direct attack, sort of. But I don't know, to me it's more like bowling with a really fat man as the ball. But even if this was an attack, Robin in this case was also using it to attack someone that she felt no sympathy towards, as well as someone who was an intrinsic threat to the voices of the past. Yama was just rolling around up a yard, smashing up ruins, whatever. And now we've got Saint Summers demanding that the voices of the past be silenced on Elbaf. And I have to say, as much as this it's not the best situation for Robin, I do love it when she has no chill whatsoever. Robin is not messing around in this chapter, and we continue to see that when she goes straight for the kill with Summers by snapping his neck in very much the same way she did against Gecko Moria on Thriller Bark. There are times in One Piece where Robin just up and decides to murder a dude. She can be so vicious and really lives up to that assassination skill she touted when she first joined the crew. But because One Piece is a story, Robin is only really allowed to use these sorts of attacks against characters who have the power to survive them. In Moria's case, he switched himself out with his Doppelman Shadow, and as for Summers, well, this man can simply regenerate all damage, which we don't see in the typical way that we've been shown with Gunko, Ethan Baron, Venus Juro, and Saint Saturn. And obviously that's because all of the regeneration is happening internally, but we do know that it's happening because we're given the same sound effect, which is the Paki Paki onomatopoeia. So there's no doubt in this chapter that Summers is using the same kind of regeneration displayed by Gunko earlier, and I guess this is our soft confirmation that all of the Holy Knights possess these abilities and have likely made some sort of pact with Imu for them. Or at the very least, they all possess the regeneration aspect, but what they may or may not, probably may not have, is the perpetual youth part. Because Figolin Garling was a Holy Knight back during God Valley, and he has since aged quite a bit, so it may only be those with the title of a Five Elder who are granted the actual immortality in addition to regeneration. Here's what I love about regeneration. Having this ability gives Oda license to go all out with brutality, which is very good for characters like Robin, who have these attacks that often need to be nerfed because of how visceral and kind of disturbing they truly are. But it also opens up a lot of nice opportunities for character writing. It's always interesting to see how certain characters respond to regeneration, by which I mean characters who possess it, how they respond to their possession of it. And in the case of Saint Summers, you can clearly see that this power has made him extremely arrogant, and it will likely contribute to his downfall. Summers doesn't think that he can be harmed, or at least he didn't think that before the end of this chapter, which we will get to, but that puts him in a position where mistakes are easily made. Summers doesn't have to do a lot of, really hard mind thinking because it doesn't matter. From his perspective, his opponents aren't physically capable of stopping him no matter what. He could make infinite mistakes, but his opponents would still lose because they can't compensate for infinity plus one. So there's some really great writing opportunities to exploit that mindset of Saint Summers. But here's what I don't like about regeneration. I am a little bit worried that Egghead Island and Elbaf are starting to set a new standard for One Piece antagonists, and that going forward, this sort of regeneration is going to need to be something that major and even minor antagonists have in some form for them to be taken seriously, which I really don't want for One Piece, but this is a very classic shonen trap. A new antagonist with a new power gets introduced, and then all subsequent antagonists need to either have that same power or an ability even more powersome than the power, because otherwise it's like taking a step down. Where's the drama? We dealt with someone stronger than this in the last arc. Step up your game, mate. And I really don't want that for One Piece, because one of its advantages is the charm of the unique villains and what they bring to the table. Something that does comfort me is that there was a bit of a fear of this happening during the days of Skypiea, because we just came from fighting a crocodile on Alabasta, who was a very tricksome Logia user, and we went straight to dealing with God Enel, another Logia. And in the hands of a lesser author, One Piece may have continued with just increasingly dangerous and annoying Logia users. However, Eiichiro Oda had the good sense to bring things way back down to earth with a Zoan antagonist in Rob Lucci. But then again, we are now in the final saga, so I don't know if bringing things back down to earth is gonna be quite on the menu. If anything, we should be skyrocketing right up. And it does feel like every main antagonist from here on out is either a Logia, a mythical Zoan, or has abyss powers, or some combination of the three, pretty much all of which allow regeneration in some form or another. But to continue giving Robin all of the credit in the world for this chapter, I loved when she tackled Summers off the tree, very much doing the classic Kirby suck and jump off the stage, but without actually needing to jump off herself. That is such an amazing use of her Devil Fruit. But again, it's one that we really can't have unless we have an opponent who can actually deal with it, because the reality of what Robin's doing here is it's actually pretty grim. I have to give it to Robin though, especially after I got ever so many comments about how she wouldn't fight Summers. She can't fight Summers. Ow, a thorn, we can't have that. And then in this chapter, Robin gets her entire clone body pierced with thorns, which she feels in her real body, and she tanks that pain like an absolute champ. Robin really doesn't get anywhere near enough credit and appreciation for what she can do in fight form from the fanbase, but to be fair, she doesn't really get enough appreciation or credit from Eiichiro Oda either. Here's another thing I noticed about this section though. This whole chapter basically takes place over the span of 30 seconds. That's the countdown that Saint Summers gives in the beginning, and we reach the full 30 seconds by the end, which I do really like as a framing device. There's something very cool about Summers continuing the countdown even though he's dealing with Robin and all of these threats of assaulted death. It's very sleek, it's very professional, and it is on point to continue the mission of destroying Elbaf's culture. But here's the thing, right? I think this is going to end up being one of the most frustrating anime episodes to watch when it gets adapted in a year or two from now, because the anime adapts at most one chapter per episode. So that episode is going to start with Summers declaring that Jarl has 30 seconds to decide, and then 10 minutes into the episode, Summers is going to say something like, "All right, mate, you've only got 20 seconds left." So we'll be moving at a rate of about 1 second per minute. Things are going to feel unbelievably slow, which isn't 100% Toei's fault. Even with a better adaptation rate of 2 to 3 chapters per episode, this section would still feel slow due to the extremely small time frame that Oda chose. But I think it's now time to highlight Little Ronya, because Robin and Scopogaban fought a hard campaign to own this chapter, but there is no doubt that it belongs to Ronya, a character who we've only just met, but one who I would now willingly die for. And you know what? I'd even be willing to take a few of you watching with me. She is worth it. And I really didn't expect to be hit this hard by one of the kids on Elbaf. Or at the very least, if I did, I expected it to be Colin. Oda tends to have a pretty standard formula with kids in One Piece. He focuses on implementing child characters a lot more than many shonen authors choose to do, and it's because Oda sees them as effective vessels to get across ideas of both the past and the future being rolled together. because these kids all come from a certain heritage. I'm talking all across One Piece, not just Elbaf. Wano, Whole Cake Island, Dressrosa, Fishman Island, Alabasta, kids are everywhere. And these kids are a product of the past. They were born and raised into a certain culture, infinitely larger and more significant than they are as individuals. But these kids are also the ones charged with taking that culture and forging a future. Momonosuke will always be the prime example of this. He had and still has the entire history and expectations of Wano on his shoulders, and eventually he will need to make a decision about whether or not to open the borders and change Wano forever. And here with Ronya, I think it's very appropriate that she gets to voice her opinion on this choice. Summers gave this decision to Jarl explicitly because of his seniority, that he was the one most experienced to make the decision. And no disrespect to Mr. Jarl, but his time is over. It's Ronya and her generation who are going to be the caretakers of culture for the next few centuries. So I think it's very valuable to hear what they have to say. And so Ronya makes a very heartfelt plea to allow her to die so that the schools and libraries are preserved. And very importantly, this is not because of how historically or culturally significant they are. Kids of that age are not capable of understanding that. But Ronya wants to make this choice because going to school makes her happy, and she doesn't want to take that happiness away from others for her sake. It's a very Luffy-like way of looking at things. Luffy doesn't concern himself with history or politics or even relationships beyond those that he directly has. It's very simple emotional maths. School makes me happy, therefore it makes other people happy, therefore school should stay. And look, little Ronya isn't insane. She knows full well the weight of this decision. She's even shaking the entire time in fear of death. And look, I dare say that the face Ronya makes right before she thinks she's about to die is a very Will of D smile. I'm not saying that she's a member of the D clan, but she certainly has that same spirit and innate philosophy that most of them are born with. And you don't need to be a D to live and die like one. Kozuki Oden wasn't a D, and yet he died with a massive smile on his face. Or Don Quixote Rocinante, who was very pleased with the treasure that he was leaving behind, from the position of being born into world nobility, the exact opposite of the Ds. And very importantly, on the same page that Ronya is prepared to die for the schools and the library, we have Jarl ordering Ange to burn them down, which is such great juxtaposition. They need to be on the same page. The decision's being made by the very youngest and the very oldest of the island. Both of them have the same goal, to keep everyone happy and safe, but they come to completely different conclusions on how to do that. And the really brilliant thing is that you cannot fault either of them for the decision they made, even though they're the exact opposite choices. And just for an extra shot of sadism, Ange does acquiesce to Jarl's command, and then there is a series of panels of Ange, Sol, and Robin, and especially Robin here. She kills me because Robin's got this expression of knowing that yes, this is the right thing to do, but the cost is that she has to give up her history, her culture, and Ohara's voices in order to save the children of Elbaf. I've spoken a lot about the narrative revival of Sol in past videos, but look, these books on Elbaf are a narrative revival of everyone on Ohara. Their will, their legacy, and their voices are all alive right now in the Owl Library. So what's happening here is Robin is being forced to leave her mother and Professor Clover to die a second time. But luckily, no such choice need be made with the arrival of Scopa-Gaban and the swift dismemberment of St. Summers, who loses a hand to the axework of Gaban. And after all of this talk about regeneration, it should be quite striking to everyone that Summers does not regenerate from this attack. Now that does not mean that he won't. The next chapter could start with him regrowing his hand, but there are currently no sound effects. There's no Paki Paki happening whatsoever. And that's not good for St. Summers. He needs that Paki Paki. And it's interesting that it's not there because his regeneration kicked in immediately after he was injured by Robin. So we could be looking at very permanent damage here, and we could be on the cusp of figuring out how to deal with this regeneration, which could be Haki related. Summers is visibly struck with what appears to be Conqueror's Haki, so perhaps the solution to regeneration is just to have the drive strong enough to exert your willpower over Imu's abilities and to say, hey, stop that now. Sort of like what happened with Zoro and Monet. In the end, she was just so terrified of Zoro that she couldn't hold herself together. But even if this was the solution, it would still make the Holy Knights quite a bit of a problem, because we're very much lacking in Conqueror's users at the moment, with Luffy and Zoro still chilling in the underworld. But the face, mate, the face that Scopa-Gaban makes at the end of this chapter, it is terrifying. This is the first instance we've seen of a deadly serious Scopa-Gaban, Goban, and I would be shocked if Summers was capable of standing up to him alone. Maybe, very maybe, with the combined abilities of Gillingham and Gunko, or maybe with a secret power that we have yet to see from the Holy Knights. But if these three don't do something quick, then their campaign on Elbaf is going to be over before Luffy even wakes up from his food coma. So we'll see what they choose to do about that, if indeed they have the time to choose anything at all. But you let me know what you thought of this chapter in the comments below. It's gotta be advanced cock that Goban used on Summers in that last scene. That's why it's taken Oda so long for the other combatants to join as well. Advanced cock is not the solution that I expected to this, but then again, we are talking about the missionary of love here. I'm very 50-50 about whether or not I'd be happy with the solution to this problem just being Haki again. For most of the New World era, it's been a series of encounter problem and then develop stronger Haki to solve said problem. So I am hoping that the Abyss presents something just a little bit different, but then again, it does entirely depend on the nature of what the Abyss even is. At the moment, we're linking it to Imu, and unless he is some sort of truly ancient supernatural being, then that would also point to this being the effect of a devil fruit. Imu's perhaps devil fruit, in which case a Haki counter does make a very standard amount of sense. But also, if just using Conqueror's Haki was the solution, then surely Luffy may have figured that out during Egghead Island, where he was fighting against 5 regenerating monster beasts. He can use Advanced Conqueror's Haki as well, so there does have to be something a bit more to this. Maybe Luffy he just still doesn't quite understand exactly what it is he's doing. But also, maybe that something more has to do specifically with the kind of Haki that Joy Boy used. Because when Emmett released the Haki not on Egghead Island, it sent the other 4 elders back to Marijois, which I suppose implies that it dispelled, or at least briefly dispelled, the effects of the Abyss. Either way, something that I do love is Summers' reaction to Scopogaban. It is so over the top, and you know what? It gives me infinitely more respect for Kizaru. When Dark King Rayleigh rocked up on Sabari, Kizaru was all like, "Ooh, Suriba's Rayleigh." And then he proceeded to tank the right-hand man of the Pirate King, whereas Saint Summers has completely, physically, and more importantly, mentally collapsed. And this may be because Summers has some history with Mr. Scopogaban, which you would have to assume happened during the God Valley incident, as it's the only known point in history that we have so far where both the Roger Pirates and the Holy Knights were in the same location. But this is the kind of reaction that, say, Warpaw would have to seeing Luffy again. Just the sight of that straw-hatted lad would send him straight into PTSD. But if it wasn't clear before, it's gotta be pretty impossible to see Saint Summers as the main antagonist of this arc now. That, or it's gotta be pretty difficult to see Elbaf as an arc that's going to last too much longer. It was his right arm. I know it's confusing from the first panel, but the final one shows his right arm amputated. So weirdly enough, in this chapter, Saint Summers gets both his left and his right arm cut off, because it changes depending on which panel you're looking at. In the initial panel with the initial cut, yes, you can see his left hand flying right off there, which makes sense because people tend to only lose their left arms in one piece. However, in the final panel, it is definitely Summers' right hand that is missing, which is a pretty big continuity error from Oda there. This isn't the kind of thing that you could blame one of the assistants on, like all of the early Elbaf errors within the clothing and the weapons. And I do think it's really strange that no one picked up on this, given that both of these panels are on the same page, right next to each other. But then again, I didn't notice it at first either, but then again, I wasn't the one drawing it. And I feel like if I was spending a whole day on this page, maybe I would have picked it up. Maybe. So I guess we'll figure out exactly which arm he's missing in the next chapter. But the real question here is, where is the mark of the Abyss on Saint Summers? Because if it just so happened to be on the arm that Scopogaban sliced off, left and or right, then that is a big problem for Summers, as he won't be able to get off Elbaf, at least not via the Abyss. He'd have to travel in a much more conventional boat method, and now that Scopogaban has arrived, I'm not sure that Summers has the patience or frankly the lifespan for that. If left arms are the only ones lost in One Piece, does that essentially confirm Scopper is going to die, as he's the left arm of the Pirate King? Look, the only answer I have to that is yes, very yes. And not just very yes, but given the history of other left arms in this series, Scopogaban is going to die in an extremely brutal way. And this may also mean quite a violent death for Sanji as the left wing of the next Pirate King. It is not a good place to stand. In pro wrestling, they work the left side of their opponent. It's a tradition since most people are right-handed, so they don't want to accidentally hurt someone's dominant hand. I see. So Oda is a massive wrestling fan, which has never been more evident than it is now on Elbaf, where most giants are directly named after pro wrestlers. So it's not out of the question that this is the philosophy he follows when maiming his characters as well. 3 straight chapter and Loki and Luffy's group still having picnic? Yeah, it is starting to feel like it's not just Oda who gets to take breaks from the manga anymore. Apparently, his characters have unionized and they've decided when they get to take time off as well. And given that Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji have the highest amount of star power, it would be pretty difficult not to give in to their demands. And you know what? At the very least, this is an interesting way to experience One Piece because this idea isn't unusual, but what is odd is the exact characters who are being sidelined. As usually, we are all about the Luffys, the Zoros, and the Sanjis, whilst the Robins, the Frankais, and the Choppers and everyone else disappear for a smoko for very, very long strings of chapters. Although I think the hardest part of all of this is Loki. I'm much less concerned about not seeing too much of Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji, but I really want to see more of Loki because I just feel that's where the actual story is. The Holy Knights are great and they're concocting cockery and everything, but until we bring Loki back into things, it is a bit hard to shake the feeling that Elbaf itself is on a bit of a break. Gunko wearing pants after being rejected by Brook is one of my favorite details in this fantastically packed chapter. Alright, I almost went insane when I saw this comment because I did not recall seeing pants on Gunko, and I would like to think that I am very well trained at spotting pants. And as it turns out, I was right, but also so was the commenter, because they may have been reading the Arabic translation, and for that localization, they give Gunko pants for fairly obvious reasons. But it's not just Gunko, no, pants for everyone. Nami also has pants, and I'm just going to go ahead and assume that most women in the Arabic One Piece world adopt pants. But here's where some more potential for confusion arises from. Due to reasons that I'm not entirely sure of myself, Arabic One Piece leaks are usually the first to come out. They get the pages and their scan groups are so unbelievably fast, which means that sometimes what the English scan groups do, right, is they use the cleaned up Arabic pages. And so from time to time, the unofficial English translations contain these little Arabic edits. So that's that mystery solved, although it would be a pretty funny gag for Gunko's panty dream to be broken and to throw a pant tantrum, if you will. I also can't help but feeling that Chopper staying put may prove decisive later on. His role so far has been rather unusual. I don't know about that. It honestly hasn't been all that unusual, not for Chopper anyway. He does tend to get tucked away more so than most Straw Hats, although he is currently the only crew member in the area who is actually free. Jinbei, Brook, Nami, and Usopp were caught by Gunko, and unless Gaban broke the ability, Robin has also been tied up by the thorns of St. Summers. So it will probably fall to Chopper to free the rest of the crew while Summers is busy wetting himself against Gaban. Ronya's speech makes me remember that something that makes us happy is worth fighting for. I am humbled and happy to be a fan and follower of a story that makes me tear up here and there, looking forward for what is coming. I think that is a very, very important message. This might just be me in my bubble, but I often feel like we human people get rather caught up in fighting against things rather than fighting for things, especially online. Very few people arguing online are actually fighting for something. They're just there to find something to get mad about and fight against. And look, what that thing is doesn't really matter, but with Ronya, Oda has really distilled the idea of fighting for positivity. And this might sound corny as crap, but to me, this is a true warrior. It's not about the size and strength of the punch fist. Not at all. It is about the size and strength of the heart. And I think that little Ronya here is showing the way forward for Elbaf, which isn't about forgetting the culture of fighting that has sustained their civilization for thousands of years, but more about changing why they're fighting and what they're fighting for. As right now we seem to have had a very snap turn away from old tradition because all of the kids apart from Colin despise violence in any form. So maybe now is the perfect time to figure out that marriage between old and new. And while we're here, it's also being brought to my attention that Ronya is likely based on Ronja Rövardotter. This is a Swedish children's fantasy book that was even adapted into an anime, but fairly recently actually. It aired in 2014. So I'd never heard of this myself, but apparently it is a very prominent book, and it's also been turned into a live-action TV show as well as a stage musical. But what's relevant to us is that part of this story involves a game of jumping across a chasm. And during this game, Ronya saves another child who almost falls. So what Ronya's doing here is very true to the literaric inspiration. Ronya, under threat of a fall, is choosing to save the happiness of the other kids. And it makes me wonder if all of these Elbaf children are based on other kids' stories. We already have at least 2 of the kids having been inspired by Vicky the Viking. So if anyone knows the origin of the other Elbaf children, please do leave it in the comments because this kind of stuff really fascinates me. Mostly because I find it incredible that Eiichiro Oda not only has the time to consistently make the world's greatest greatest weekly manga series, but he also seems to have the time to conduct all of this exhaustive research into all of these different stories across different cultures and incorporate key elements of them into One Piece. I just don't see how all of this is possible. There's only 24 hours in a day, and yeah, even though he only sleeps for about 3 hours, even 21 hours a day still doesn't seem like enough time to make all of this happen. Hey, it's me on a thumbnail. That's right, Mr. Gaban, you've been on a lot of my thumbnails recently, which usually indicates that you are the most excitable and YouTube-friendly character in the thumbnail. Keep up the good work. Remember Garp's lesson about who to save between an old man and a child. It hits different when you think about it in this situation. It hits very different because you're heavily changing the stakes of Garp's conundrum. In Garp's hypothetical, there was only one old man and one child, and he said without question you save the child and you leave that old man to die. But what Summers has set up here is a choice between one child and tens of thousands of old people. In fact, with Elbaf and Ohara, we have 2 whole civilizations worth of voices on the line here being stacked up against that single child. And to his credit, Jarl makes the decision that Garp would have, and the philosophy that Garp tried to instill into his Marines. But of course, Ronya then went and made the exact same decision that Koby did. In response to Garp's problem, Koby claimed that he would sacrifice himself to allow both the child and the old man to live, which was the conclusion that Ronya landed on. The idea that the best solution was to sacrifice herself to allow everyone else to be happy. So we have quite an interesting cross-cultural generational divide, and I can only hope that things turn out much better on Elbaf than they did on Hachinosu, because in the end, Koby did have to leave Garp behind. Even if they burn the library, Vegapunk has all the knowledge in his big brain. Right, I've been seeing this or a variation on this comment a lot, and it is true. All of the books on Ohara are in the Vega brain, but Punk Records has currently disappeared from the world. The 4 satellites who are crammed into one fusion body said that they would effectively be the gatekeepers of this knowledge until a day comes where humanity is actually capable of, quote, wrangling it themselves. And Shaka then estimated that it would take 500 years to reach that point. So that's quite a few years, and so I'm not sure if we can afford to lose the OWL library here. But it's not even about that. It's not about the knowledge itself. It's about the fact that these schools and these libraries bring happiness to people. That's more the core of what we're fighting for here rather than the contents of the library, which is why it is even more important that we keep these buildings. I thought for sure you would talk about how we got another classic pirate thing, walking the plank. Yeah, look, I didn't even pick up on that. But this is very classic Oda subversion. For most of One Piece, the impression has been that pirates are the bad guys, and the Straw Hats as well. Some others have slowly been flipping that impression into something that resembles more heroicness. And now what we have here are the enemies of the pirates using a stereotypical pirate device to portray evil. Seeing Scopper Gaban that kind of serious actually makes me realize we've never seen Roger serious like that. Crazy to imagine the aura the man must have had. You know, that's not something I've ever thought about. The Roger we've always seen, and look, I mean this in the best of ways, the Roger we've always seen has been a bit one note. We've never really seen him pushed to the brink or out of his comfort zone like we have with Luffy, and I think that is very much on purpose. Because when it comes to Roger, we're not really following a man so much as we're following a legend. And so keeping Roger very consistently in this joyous adventure mode makes him feel much larger than life, like a mythical archetype rather than a more identifiable human. It's also worth mentioning that this is an era that Luffy has just entered. After Gear 5th, we've seen a pretty massive reduction in his serious dramatic emotions, because now that he's achieved this level of freedom, he's just free to enjoy the adventure. And that is the form that we usually see Roger in as well, not a literal Gear 5th, but most of what we see of Roger is after he's reached the peak of the world. He still has his rivals like Shiki and Whitebeard, but most of what we see of Roger features exercising the level of freedom that Luffy really wants to. And come to think of it, this is very much Luffy's prelude to Pirate King era. The Luffy that we're seeing right now is the equivalent of the Roger we saw in Oden's flashback, and their personalities are strikingly similar. Mr. Internet Man, if I were the Holy Knights, I'd perhaps be a little more concerned about the Emperor sleeping in the basement. They've managed to hit a 3 for 3 of things that piss Luffy off. They're hurting Robin, they've made Nami cry, and they've attacked the people who fed him. Yeah, I have to be real here. I have no idea what the Holy Knights are even thinking at this point. All of them are terrified of the idea of confronting Luffy, but they're not doing anything to not confront him. By now, they have half of his crew crew captured, and quite frankly, it's not the half that you would like to have captured. Most of them are not the half that you need to truly be worried about. And also, you would have to assume that the Holy Knights didn't know that Scopa Gaban was living on Elbaf. They probably haven't been to this island at all in 5 to 6 decades, because they were all quite surprised at the cultural shift. So it must come as quite a shock to discover the left arm of the Pirate King is setting up shop here. So at what point do they either retreat or call for help? Because even if Summer still had 2 hands, this would be getting out of hands. At this stage, we've got to be betting on Singh killing him. He's the only one that has yet to really show himself in direct combat, so maybe he is their trump card in these kind of situations. Can we talk about Ulti's cape? We sure can, because this is actually a pretty big deal. Ulti is currently cloaked in what appears to be the symbol of the Kozuki clan, and I'd wager that page 1 probably has one as well. And Ulti's even performing a very polite bow, so these two have made their full transition and are now vassals of Yamato, who is carrying on the will of Odin, and therefore they are Kozuki vassals. It's almost like the next generation of Odin's vassals. And Yamato's also been given an Amigasa to take to Kawamatsu and Hakumai, which is our next stop and the second last destination on our Wano tour. That's also where Yamato will be laying Yasuo's sword to rest. And after that, there's only one stop left, which is Ringo, which is where I think we'll finally see Kiku. She's probably the daimyo of Ringo, which is where Izo was buried, so that makes a lot of sense. But after that, bam, we have completed our journey across Wano. And from there, Yamato's gonna need to make a decision. Because after that, this was the point in Odin's journey where he gathered enough vassals to be named daimyo of his own territory, which was the then unlawful zone of Kuri. But all of Wano is currently spoken for, well, except for one territory. I know that it's currently underwater, but perhaps Yamato could be named the daimyo of Onigashima, or whatever the original name of that island was. I think it's interesting that they specifically pointed out that if Bronya fell, she'd be falling down to the underworld. There are people we know down there after all, and it's not totally out of the question for Luffy to giant up and catch a falling kid from the sky. It does feel like we're definitely setting up for one of the kids to fall and to be saved by the group that are currently in the underworld. And mate, especially if it's Luffy, just think of the symbolism in that. A D-wielding demon emerges from the underworld. That is Gunko's worst nightmare right there. A devil from the underworld coming to destroy everything that the Holy Knights are charged with maintaining. And not just one devil, no, we are looking at potential multi-devils here, with the fire demon Diablo Jumble that is Sanji, the self-proclaimed king of hell that is Zoro, and Loki, who doesn't even need any other fancy names or titles, because that is how much of a demon he is. All of the most terrifying people are right there below them, and the Holy Knights are unknowingly goading all of these demons by sending kids falling down to them. So I can only wait in eager anticipation for the Holy Knights to realize just what a huge mistake it is they've made. Imu is here. The Holy Land is burning, Elbaf is also burning, and the monster trio are still waiting whilst Gunko is remembering. Remembering what, you may ask? Well, it's something that makes this the most consequential chapter of Elbaf to date. And this chapter begins with a surprisingly notable color spread. One thing I really like about the color spread is the inclusion of Lilith and Bonnie as part of the temporary crew. Although the reason why Lilith is in the maid cafe is because she is the Vegapunk who is always concerned about money to fund their research. So if anything, I reckon she's probably the one who has set the prices in the cafe, and that's why Usopp is going out of his mind looking at them. This is Lilith and Nami's operation. Robin and Bonnie, they've just been conscripted for the love of the game. And Bonnie here is also looking quite adorable. This sort of Bonnie art, I find it really heartwarming because we've never really gotten to see her just be a child and enjoy messing around without life or death consequences. Although I will say that her holding what I think is a tray with Rip on it felt pretty morbid when I saw it. So I think because there is a hyphen, the full text is supposed to read as Rip Off. Like Shaki's Rip Off bar, this is the Straw Hat's Rip Off Maid Cafe. But I saw Bonnie, I saw Rip, and so the first thing I thought of was rest in peace. And it also really doesn't help that the position of the tray looks a lot like a tombstone. My first thought, which I'm glad isn't true, is that this was a Kuma reference. Like Bonnie was holding a rest in peace dad sort of thing. But what I like most about this color spread is how unusually localized it is. And I think that's because Oda has really really cut down on the amount of characters that are in it. Usually when Oda tries to include the entire crew, it means that he has to do some big outdoor landscape, so we really don't get a lot of these lovely smaller scale scenes. But enough of maid cafes and into very serious fictional pirate business. We pick up exactly where we left off, and Copacabana's first line of dialogue in this chapter is pretty perfect, because it's the same thing that every grizzled old legend says when they step into combat. It's always some variation of, oh, I got rusty, or I got old, or mate, I'm no longer in my prime. We saw it with Garp, we saw it with Rayleigh, we saw it with Whitebeard, and it's just such a boss thing to say, because it always happens after a world-class display of power like a galaxy impact, or in this case, after bisecting a holy knight. And there is so much that I love about this. The first is that Copacabana is completely no nonsense. He slices through St. Summers like a buttered scone at high tea, and he just moves on. And the second is that axe combat is surprisingly fun to read, and we really don't get a lot of this sort of fighting style in One Piece. Whenever weapons are brought up, they are 99% of the time going to be swords, and if someone does have a more unique style of weapon, they're generally a fodder character that doesn't really get to showcase how a master fighter would actually wield that weapon. So I'm loving this, and I really want to see more axe stuff. But the third is that, mate, it is so incredibly satisfying to see St. Summers wiped like a stain off a toilet. And more specifically, what I was waiting for was the inevitable reaction on Twitter, which did not disappoint, as we were granted this spectacular artwork by Togashi depicting the trauma that St. Summers endured on God Valley. And with that in mind, Summers is pretty lucky that Copacabana's a bit busy this time around and can't stay to decimate him further. But despite Copacabana coming in to ruin everything for the Holy Knights, it turns out that he is slightly too late on a couple of counts. Firstly, the Owl Library and the Walrus School are now on fire. And during this part, I had a really bad brain moment. When Killingham raised the bow and flaming arrow, I was all like, where did he get that? He wasn't carrying those before. But then I realized that he probably just put himself to sleep and got one out of his dream. But that confuses me somewhat as well, because how does Killingham pull something out of his own head while he's asleep? So far, I'm pretty sure that we've only seen him put others to sleep and take stuff out of their dreams, because he had to request salt for his food from Summers. And if Killingham could use the powers on himself, then why not just do that? Why not just get your own salt, you lazy dream dragon? And also, if Killingham could do this to himself, then this devil fruit would almost be on par with Luffy for sheer ridiculousness. If Killingham can manifest anything that he can personally imagine, then it's just one step down from Luffy's devil fruit, because it does require that extra step of going to sleep first. But I don't know if that's the case. So maybe he got Ange to dream of a bow and arrow and took them out of her dream. Either way, seeing Robin's reaction to all of this was simply heartbreaking. At this stage, she is still trapped in the thorns of Summers, and she's not just crying, but I think that Robin is also shaking. There's a definite traumatic response happening here as Robin watches O'Hara burn for a second time. And honestly, I didn't think this was a big deal at first, because look, I know this is a story, so sure, the fire has started, but after Gaban's humiliation of St. Summers, it felt like all we needed to do was untie Nami and Jinbei, and this was going to be cleared up pretty easy. But knowing how this chapter ends makes the fire far more threatening and dramatic, because depending on the powers of Imu, I don't know if it's going to be as easy to make what I just said happen as I originally thought. We'll get to that, but first, our start of the last chapter, Ronya. As the fire begins, Gunko brings Ronya back off the plank. A very nice thing for Gunko to do, by the way. I feel like a true world noble probably would not have let Ronya live, and they probably would have pushed her off the arrow just for the lulz. It's almost as if there's a good side to Gunko, or at least a less bad side, which is a wild idea that's certainly never come up on this channel before. But before we get to that, Ronya, she destroyed me. She destroyed me worse than Robin when she apologized for still being alive. It hit me right in the Nico Robins. Ronya blames the fact that she's alive for everything burning right now, and even though the other kids and the giants try to speak some sense to her, I think what I would really love is for Robin and Ronya to spend some time together, and for Robin to reassure Ronya from her own experiences that her life matters more. Because here, Ronya really is a micro Robin on a very giant scale, but Robin thought the fact that she was alive at all was a sin, and that eventually it would be better for her to die so that the rest of the crew could live. That's the same sort of situation that Ronya finds herself in now, but we litigated all of that 20 years ago, and I say litigated because this trial did take place on the judicial island of Enies Lobby. TLDR, I'm really glad that Ronya's safe, and she is still my favorite Elbaf child. Now, there are a lot of highlights in this chapter, but Gaban versus Gunko, oh, that was something pretty special. And it continues to highlight the amazing potential of Gunko's abilities. This is swiftly becoming one of my favorite devil fruits. Firstly, by using the arrow arrows to dodge an attack from the left arm of the Pirate King, something that Mr. St. Summers wasn't quite capable of. But this chapter also showed us a pretty incredible invocation of Future Sight, where Scopogaban saw that if he acted, Gunko would have been able to kill Colin before he got to her. Not very nice of Gunko. In fact, potential child murderer confirmed she was gonna do it. I cannot believe that I ever thought that she might be good. And the only chance that Gunko has at redemption now is if she's being controlled by some sort of external force. But I think that would be a pretty big stretch. I love this panel though because I am such a huge fan of bad futures. Another great time I remember this happening was Luffy during the Udon prison section of Wano, where he saw a bad future with the spread of Queen's weapon, and also Shanks seeing Eustace Kid destroy his entire Grand Fleet. That was also incredible. I love bad futures because it puts a lot of dramatic weight onto whoever is using the Future Sight to then prevent that future. And other than a handful of times, Future Sight does tend to be used pretty basically in One Piece. It's usually not all that exciting, but this is the sort of thing that I've been waiting for. A bad future that can't just be stopped by thwacking the bad guy about to implement said future. And I think part of this could have to do with Gunko's Devil Fruit. A lot of people get a bit confused whenever I bring this up, but Gunko does seem to have some control of the future, because that's how Gunko herself describes the ability. Those arrows are the confirmed path of my very future. A declaration of unavoidable violence, but it is possible for me to change, of course. And sure, maybe Gunko is just using frustratingly florid language to describe how the powers work, but what Scopogaban saw when he used Observation Haki was an unavoidable future, a declaration of violence. There is something about this ability that even Scopogaban could not overcome in this moment. However, it is worth noting that Scopogaban is fighting at a pretty significant handicap, which is Colin's well-being, and this is becoming a very well-explored concept in the final saga. I've already made a video about the potentially very real and tangible power of love that Oda is manifesting with parental and other familial relationships, but great power also comes at great cost. And on Egghead Island, Oda opened up a different avenue of discussion with the Kuma flashback, and seeing Gaban's situation in this chapter, I couldn't help but think of Dragon's words. When Kuma was approaching the topic of children, Dragon stopped that conversation dead in its tracks by saying, "Keep going if you want to see me killed." Children are a vulnerability for any parent, which was certainly proved with Bartholomew Kuma and now Scopogaban. And on Elbaf, despite beating St. Summers, Scopogaban has still ended up falling into the trap he set up. We don't have the thorns harming him, but Scopogaban got skewered regardless in order to save his son's life. And that is how you quite convincingly defeat the left arm of the Pirate King. These elements all need to line up perfectly, otherwise someone like Gunko wouldn't stand a chance. And so I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. I mean, not happy, I'm not thrilled that Scopogaban got turned into a kebab, but I do think it was well handled. And the really cool thing about this is that Scopogaban is falling seemingly right all the way down to the underworld, which should finally activate and alert the monster trio Loki and the new giant warrior pirates who are just kind of sitting this whole conflict out at the moment. That or Scopogaban will go, "Good ideas, mates," and join them in the waiting room. And what we'll do for the rest of Elbaf, right, is we'll gradually send all of our strongest fighters down there until we are just left with Usopp versus Emu all on his own, and that is how he'll become a brave warrior of the sea. That is, of course, a joke, because we all know now that this was never Usopp's arc, as the last 2 pages of this chapter drop a series of narrative bombshells, none of which involve him. The first is that Colin screaming for his dad triggers a memory of what appears to be Gunko screaming for her father, who very much appears to be Brook. With the information that we have, that is the most straightforward implication of this flashback. Other options are of course possible, like maybe Gunko was Calico Yorkie's daughter, for example, or another acquaintance of Brook, both of which are ideas that I'd previously dismissed, but man, meat's back on the menu, boys. And I'd just like to take a moment to say rest in peace for all of those who lacked the faith in Oda being completely 100% predictable when it comes to pretty women in One Piece. About a month ago, I made a video about why I was pretty certain that Gunko was either going to turn good or was good somehow deep down, and it received a lot of comments such as, "Gunko is not switching, hands down." And mate, I want to see those hands right the crap up in the comments. I don't say this to gloat about fictional pirates. This isn't some special Nen ability possessed by a man on the internet. Anyone could have predicted this because Oda does it with every single arc. And if this were not so closely tied to Brook, I would even go so far as to say that I'm a bit disappointed that we're going down the same road again. But because this holds such a rich promise of Brook history, I'm on board with it. And the only reason why I'm not 100% sold that Gunko is Brook's daughter at this point is that she calls him Brook instead of, say, Dad, which most children call their fathers. Although in typical One Piece fashion, this could be a case of Gunko not being Brook's biological daughter, but more like a parental mentor figure, in which case using his first name makes a lot of sense. Nami, for example, doesn't just call Belle-Mère her mother, she uses her name. Although to be fair, Belle-Mère is French for mother-in-law, so I guess she technically does call her mother, but you get the idea. Maybe Gunko was watching her father be killed by some sort of holy knight, and after that point, Brook took her in. Maybe that is a thing. And then more bad things happened. Because look, we never know the mechanics of exactly how it's going to happen, but Pretty Woman villain, no matter what terrible thing she does, is always going to get a narrative out that excuses her actions. In this case, that narrative excuse seems to be that Gunko had her memories erased, and in fact, Gunko may not even be her real name. And it's just this moment of seeing a father sacrifice himself for his child has triggered this memory, which does seem like a very power of love kind of thing to do. Whatever mind control that Gunko is under, it cannot be broken by fictional fruit or haki, but it can be damaged by love. And something rather curious about the flashback silhouette of Brook is his sword. It looks suspiciously like the same sword that the Figland family use as holy knights. And if I was some sort of raving lunatic on the internet, this is where I would put forward the idea that Brook himself may have once been a holy knight, and that is how he knows about them. I definitely don't think that's the safe idea to jump to at this stage. The sword could also be something much more generic. Brook was a big military general dude before he became a pirate, so the sword is probably something more standard issue from his home country, but it is definitely not his trademark Shikumizuwe. And you've really got to wonder just how strong the juxtaposition is here. How much of what happened with Colin and Scopa-Gaban happened with Brook and Gunko? Did Brook or did Gunko's perhaps biological father sacrifice himself for her in a similar manner? Hence why the memory triggered. Oda tends to be pretty careful and deliberate with how he sets these things up, and there is a lot of deliberate repetition in his storytelling. So I'm thinking that once we see this Brook flashback, or once we see this Gunko flashback, that it's going to end up being pretty similar to what happened here on Elbaf, or at least pretty similar to what just happened here with Gaban and Colin. And you know what? This could go a long way towards explaining why Brook hasn't asked to see Gunko's panties. Apart from the fact that we can all already see them, that's just not a good question to ask your daughter or otherwise daughter-like figure. I gotta say though, I'm pretty damn hyped for this. And it would have been more than enough for me to end the chapter on that note for the final panel to be that flashback, but Oda went far beyond that. As in the final panels of the chapter, Imu appears to take control of Gunko's body, and I guess we are now fighting directly against Imu, which is threatening to show us the power of a god. And that is not the first time that a One Piece character has made that threat. However, it may very well be the first time that I have believed it. So this is a pretty big win for everyone who said that Gunko was some sort of vassal or satellite of Imu, because there is some kind of connection like that. And it now seems likely that Gunko could even have been present in the throne room when King Cobra was killed, because he was skewered by an arrow. So perhaps Imu was possessing Gunko then as well, or maybe it's just a regular well-aimed devil tail. Don't know, but I'm no longer ignoring the direct Imu-Gunko connection anymore. And our third massive bombshell that gets dropped over the course of these 2 pages cannot be ignored, and it is that the Holy Land of Marijois is currently under attack, and not only that, it is rather ironically on fire and burning, which is, you know, kind of exactly what they deserve as they're currently trying to burn down Elbaf's buildings. And from here, I wonder if the Holy Knights get recalled to Marijois to fix the more immediate problem, and that's how we solve the Elbaf conflict, and then move on to all the Loki stuff, which would give Brook a pretty big reason to maybe want to go to Marijois to sort out this Gunko business, but I can't imagine that Imu will spend too much time here given the current crisis. So we might get, you know, a little taste of his true power and then move on. But the bigger, much bigger question here is who is currently attacking the Holy Land? I've got a few different candidates in mind. Dragon feels like a pretty obvious one. The Revolutionary Army was, of course, founded to get rid of the world nobles, but I also wouldn't put this kind of attack past Blackbeard, who we have seen in preparation for a large-scale invasion of an unknown location. But in addition to him, I'd also like to nominate Sakazuki, who is the most recent person of prominence that we saw in the Holy Land, and he may have had enough of being a servant of the world nobles and taken justice into his own hands, deciding to burn it all. But it also may shock you to discover that Eiichiro Oda already drew this scene 7 years ago, when, for currently unknown reasons, an artwork of a mysterious man burning Pangaea Castle was revealed as part of the One Piece World Seeker game promotion. So Eiichiro Oda has been planning this for quite some time, and we are going to dive into all of that and so much more in the next video. But for now, you let me know what you think in the comments below. The Holy Land being on fire might be the reason why Shamrock was brought back to Marijois if I had to bet a fictional pirate money. I think that would be a pretty good bet of fictional currency. Maybe Shamrock was recalled when this crisis began and it seemed like we just needed a little extra firepower to bring it under control before realizing that firepower was a very poorly chosen word as it started burning all of our own buildings. Although what this means is that whoever is attacking the Holy Land is a force powersome enough to keep Shamrock busy. And not just busy, but Imu makes it sound like they're even losing. And there just can't possibly be that many people in the world who are capable of doing that. And this person in question may be the figure shown as part of the One Piece World Seeker promotional material, which is the thing for whatever reason. But if you're curious, the Japanese text says, "The Holy Land Marijois engulfed in flames." Who is this mysterious figure in this untouchable sacred place? So in the game, it is the intention of the very boringly named antagonist Isaac to fly into Marijois and do all sorts of bad things, but that never happens. It never even comes close to happening. And it's very likely that this image was an early concept for the game that never eventuated, but Oda has had this in mind for a while, and I think it's very much to his credit as an author that we as readers can't immediately identify who is responsible for this act. Although I will say that Dragon and the Revolutionary Army taking action would be horrendous for the 2025 Grand Line Review bingo card, because this is the 1 year that we have bet on him doing nothing as per usual. I'm also not sure if he's actually in a position to do such a thing. In terms of the One Piece timeline, we've really only just come back from the Reverie operation. Sabo got back to Dragon during Egghead Island, which I think in terms of timeline happened yesterday? Pretty much no time has passed since Egghead and Elbaf. In fact, it may even still be the same day as the Egghead incident right now. And if so, I don't think that the Revolutionary Army will have had enough time to remobilize and deploy, unless you believe the grand conspiracy theory about Dragon once having been a Holy Knight and being able to use the Abyss himself. Imagine if the mark of the Abyss was his face tattoo, for example. But even then, he'd theoretically only be able to go alone. So as much as the Revolutionary Army does feel like the most natural enemy here, they're not necessarily the most logical one. Unless, of course, you believe in another conspiracy theory of the time dilation happening on Elbaf. And that's why Imu's popping in here being all like, guys, why was it taking you so long? It's been weeks since you left. I'm not happy with you. But assuming no time shenaniganry, in the last video I mentioned that the last person of prominence who we saw at Marijois was Fleet Admiral Sakazuki being berated by the world nobles. And so this could be the moment where he's finally snapped. 2 years of being Fleet Admiral with no progress made and getting rather fed up with constantly compromising his own sense of justice for whatever the crap it is that the Five Elders are commanding him to do. That would be such a big shift though, and it would probably mark the official beginning of the final war because the Marines would be fractured. But also the Holy Land could be burning because Sakazuki is the only one there to defend it, and his abilities are not well suited to defense. Although speaking of defense, we do also have a surprise candidate for defender of the Holy Land. My guess is that the Revolutionary Army attacked Marijois, and Blackbeard has been monitoring the situation through Lafitte so he can swoop in, save the Celestial Dragon's collective asses, and then ask to officially be made a king as a reward. Alright, that that is something that I keep putting out of my mind because this ambition of Blackbeard doesn't fully make sense to me yet. But yes, Blackbeard's goal currently is to turn Hachinosu into a world government affiliated nation, and he's even floated the name of the Blackbeard, and he originally wanted to use Koby as a bargaining chip for that admission before Blackbeard found out what sword was and that Koby was also a sword. But in lieu of Koby, Blackbeard now has an even more valuable hostage with Monkey D. Garp, and it would certainly be a lot more tempting for the world government to give Blackbeard what he wants with the life of the hero of the Marines at stake. Garp is a symbol of strength and stability that they can't really afford to lose right now. What I still don't get is why Blackbeard wants to be part of the world government so badly. His status as an emperor is already arguably higher than any single king, so making it official must be an integral step in his master plan because his sights are definitely set much higher than that. I do also think that the world government would be absolutely insane to take him up on this because we've already seen that episode. Blackbeard butted up the world government in order to become a warlord of the sea, and he immediately betrayed them with the Impel Down incident. And if he does get made into an official king, he's just gonna do the exact same thing again, but on a much larger scale. He became a warlord to get access to these funky marine-only areas, so there might be some world government-only zone that he's trying to get into as well. Anyway, I don't quite know what he's up to, but the commenter here is very correct. Blackbeard may not be the aggressor with the current Marijois situation, but with the Marines stretched as thin as they are, and with the Holy Knights apparently being useless, if Blackbeard did swoop in here to save the world nobles, then they would probably reward him for that. Because there has been an interesting story thread happening with the world nobles being fed up with their current administration set up to protect them, protect and feed. Their personal guards are useless, and the Marines are suffering defeat after defeat on an unprecedented scale. And even Fleet Admiral Sakazuki was unable to apprehend a singular invader in Bartholomew Kuma. So from the perspective of the world nobles, all of these dudes are beyond useless and causing a food shortage that means they cannot eat their precious lobster. So if Blackbeard was to present them with an alternative option, not one that necessarily completely supplants the Marines, but one that could just be used to bolster their forces, kind of like what the Holy Knights exist to do at the moment, then it may be something that the world nobles are stupid enough and irritated enough to consider. The worst thing is if Killingham gets a hold of Frankie, Pluton blueprints. If he knows or just even makes Frankie go to sleep, the blueprints might be swimming in the dream bubble. So that is one of the most horrifying future possibilities I've ever read, and that would be a brilliant use of Killingham's abilities, so brilliant that I don't think that St. Killingham himself would have the agency to do it. Even though he's starting to show himself as a little bit of a prick with all of this burning, I do still have quite a soft spot for St. Killingham. He's just the right cocktail of weird personality plus crazy fruit power that will always make me want more of him. And given our recent revelation regarding Gunko, it's not impossible to see Killingham being put in a similar situation where his memory was wiped and he was then put through some sort of process of becoming a Holy Knight. The difference being that Gunko is not a saint. This is Saint Killingham, Saint Rimoshifu Killingham. So he's got the holy name and everything. He's like a proper world noble, which makes him a lot harder to redeem. Not impossible, we've seen it done before, just harder. But a lot of this Pluton discussion would also involve someone knowing that Frankie can perfectly imagine the blueprints, because the world government don't seem to be aware of that, as no one ever cares about Frankie, sometimes not even the author of the series. Whenever the Straw Hats hit a new island, if the world government happens to be around, their focus is always on capturing that Nico Robin. So I don't think anyone's paying attention to Frankie anymore, which may one day result in another Pluton being built and not being used by the world government. And one last thing about Killingham is that he does drop a rather important piece of information in this chapter, which is when Imu takes control of Gunko's body, Killingham yells, "Imu-sama?" which is the first confirmation we've had that the Holy Knights know about Imu. Yes, it's been incredibly likely that they do, but it is now confirmed that it's not just the 5 elders who know about him. Imu Def is a baddie. I can't disagree because look, not only were the Gunko vessel and Gunko good theories somewhat confirmed in this chapter, but Oda has also unintentionally confirmed the fan art theory of Imu with giant breasts by having him take control of Gunko. It is happening. It's almost like Oda has been reading every recent Elbaf theory and decided to find a way to bring them all to life. Gaban, a man who a few years prior found the greatest hidden treasure the world has to offer, looking at his newborn son and calling him the treasure of a lifetime, absolutely destroyed me. Now, this comment did briefly mess with my head, because I was all like, what do you mean a few years earlier? But then you remember that Colin is 20, which I've pointed out so many times, but I keep forgetting. And he really was born relatively soon after Scopper Gaban discovered the One Piece with the rest of the Roger Pirates. And there is something incredibly touching about a man who has seen the world's most coveted treasure, but who has found his own personal One Piece in the birth of his child. And during this section, I am 100% convinced that Oda is using Scopper Gaban as a self-insert character to express his own feelings about his own children. He's the most successful mangaka of all time, by far the richest, but his daughters remain his greatest treasure. Gunko being Calico Yorkie's daughter could be hinted at by her heterochromia. After all, it's a common trait found in calico cats. Mate, don't go telling me things like that. I might actually start to believe them. Heterochromia, in case you don't know, is the condition of having two different colored eyes, just like Miss Gunko, and it is indeed extremely common in their calico cats. And look, this is exactly the kind of crap that Oda would pull. So for me, yes, that is 1 point in favor of the Yorkie daughter idea, although it does sound quite depressing. For this to work, surely Yorkie and Brook would have needed to believe that Gunko had died. Otherwise, I doubt they would have set off on their fun pirate journey knowing that she'd been caught. That or Brook and Yorkie pulled a Shanks Usopp maneuver and just abandoned the family to pursue their manly dreams of adventuring the seas. And the only reason why part of Brook's dream at the moment isn't to find Gunko is because he just assumes that she'd already be dead by now. Props to Chopper though. Man saw blood and wanted to know how to get more. Really followed Gaban, knowing his killing technique. Yeah, this was a kind of undoctorly response from Tony Chopper. He saw Scopper Gaban inflict a wound and he was like, mate, I want to know how to inflict wounds. He's turned his medical mind brain away from healing and put his full focus on damaging. And I really do hope that Chopper is able to figure something out. A lot of the other Straw Hats are getting some great moments on Elbaf, but none of those Straw Hats so far are Chopper. So imagine this, right? Chopper follows Scopper Gaban and he does figure it out, and he's able to convert it into some sort of medical understanding that gives him a theory to test, and Chopper then becomes the second person to deal permanent damage to a Holy Knight, or even the first character to damage Lord Emu himself. Almost certainly not, but I can dream. Chopper did bolt after Scopper Gaban though, and he saw him get turned into Scopper Kebab. And in fact, looking back on the chapter, Chopper does appear to have jumped down after Gaban, as depicted by this vaguely reindeer-shaped scribble that I definitely missed the first time around. So he really could be slowly siphoning off everyone and plonking them in the underworld. And if he's down there, then Chopper might even be able to heal Loki faster as well. His injuries are supposed to take a bunch of months to heal, but Gerd is not a genius reindeer, and Chopper may be able to find a much quicker way because he's healed far worse damage incurred by the Straw Hats in the past at much quicker rates, specifically Zoro. Chopper's experience patching up Zoro would make Loki's situation seem like treating a mild cough. But yeah, I didn't even notice that Chopper jumped down the first time I read this, and this is the sort of thing that the One Piece anime is really good for. It might take 5 minutes to happen, but rest assured, no one is going to miss that he jumped down. Of course, this is probably just a skill issue on my part, but something that Oda does do often is portray very important actions in very small scribbles in already small panels. But that aside, I am really looking forward to this duo of Chopper and Scopper Gaban, who until further notice will be labeled as Chopper Gaban. Does Chopper use their immortality power to study medicine? That is another option. Not that Chopper pursues immortality itself, but uses it to discover some sort of scientific fragment that could lead to him developing a cure for all disease. Because as magicsome as all of this regeneration is, if it is happening, then it is possible to replicate through science, as Vegapunk has started to prove by duplicating Devil Fruit powers. So this could be the unexpected key to realizing Chopper's up until now extremely unrealistic dream. Hell of the Crimson Lotus reminds me of Impel Down Level 1. I wonder if there's a connection. Alright, I am so excited that somebody else noticed this. I really wanted to point this out in the chapter review, but I didn't want to spend too much time talking about all these weird rabbit holes with all of the other crap that was happening. But get this right, when Scopper Gaban rocks up, Summers tries to use an attack that's been translated as Hell of the Crimson Lotus, where he turns the blades of grass below him into spikes, and so his abilities may be responsible for creating level 1 of Impel Down, the Crimson Hell, which was the exact same idea. It was a forest of spikes that had been turned red by the blood of those who had been impaled on them. So here's what I think happened, right? When this level was being conceived, they brought in an actual forest and some actual grass. They grew it. It probably looked lovely, too lovely for Impel Down, and then had Summers use his ability to turn the whole forest into spikes, because the Crimson Hell is even named directly after his ability. That or the other way around. Summers was so inspired by Impel Down that he replicated it, but that's the much less simple solution, although it also could have been done by the former user of his Devil Fruit. Either way, what we saw in this chapter was almost certainly the origin of level 1 of Impel Down. Man, it's kind of crazy and cool that the monster trio have become so powerful that they need to be taken out of the story in order for things to be able to happen. That is exactly what's happened, although this has been a fairly common trend of One Piece. Luffy almost always gets distracted or trapped in something to keep him from showing up until the final fight is ready. Zoro gets conveniently lost until it's time for him to cut something, and Sanji, to his credit, is usually much more in the main meat of the conflict, but it's not usually enough to take care of things by himself. But I do also think we're at a point where it would be difficult to see Zoro, Luffy, or Sanji being caught by, say, Gunko, like most of the crew are now. We know what they can do, so it would just be too much of a narrative leap to buy. So Oda has been keeping them out of the picture for interesting things to happen. The problem with One Piece is I always want to hate the bad guys, but they're always hot, charismatic, or both. Exactly right. You just feast your eyes on this hot pot of charisma right here. This is why the Holy Land made the St. Charles pinup calendar to begin with. I'm not sure if you heard or saw, but the Boston Red Sox held a One Piece themed night, and it was really amazing to see everyone there for the game. Alright, full disclosure, I know nothing about baseball. It's a sport that we Australians find incredibly boring, which is extremely hypocritical because this country obsesses over cricket, of all things. But I had to look this up, and it seems like a really fun night. I love that One Piece is breaching the mainstream through all of these avenues of sport, because this is far from the only time. One Piece also did a special night with the Lakers featuring a custom animation, and they've also done a collaboration with Dortmund in Germany, and at the moment it seems like it's a race for every team in every league to get that exclusive One Piece collaboration. They've done this so many times now that I've lost track, and so if there are any other major teams in any relevant sport that has done this, then put it in the comments. I want to see it. But here's one negative thing I will say. You've got to feel pretty bad for whoever's going up against the team that has the endorsement of the future Pirate King. It really sucks to be them. Not every pretty woman got redemption. Just look at Black Maria. Alright, for that I would say let's wait until the end of Yamato's cover story, because we did already get an ulti redemption, so more could happen. Watch closely as Oda transforms Brook's "Can I See Your Panties" jokes into one of the saddest scenes in Elbaf. Gunko most likely loved a certain pattern on her undies, and Brook foolishly hoped to find her that way. Alright, this sounds completely insane, but also it could really happen. Oda could turn the panties joke into one of the hardest hitting moments in the series. He has the narrative powers to do so. And even if it's not that exactly, there must be an origin to this gag. We didn't see him do it in his flashback with the Rumbar Pirates, likely because that was an all-male crew, and we never saw them encounter any women, so there was just no one to ask. So this was either something that started before he became a pirate, or a behavior he developed during his 5 decades of loneliness. But this is something that would reshape how we view such a huge chunk of the series. When going back and rereading or rewatching Thriller Bark, it would no longer be the nostalgia of a wacky skeleton asking for panties, but more of a moment of your significant other asking why you are tearing up over a wacky skeleton asking for panties. That is the One Piece effect, and I cannot wait to see what Oda has in store for Brook's history. The final boss of One Piece is here. His patience is limited, his powers are maximum, his pants are missing, but no one wants to be the one to tell him that for obvious reasons. And with a literal devil plus a wacky rubber hose cartoon protagonist, One Piece is now officially gunning to do its best impression of the final boss fight of Cuphead. So it's been speculated that Imu is a literal devil ever since we saw his arrow tail pierce Nefertari Cobra. It just looks like one of those classic cartoon devil tails, and the design of our Gunko being possessed by not our Emu is following that in all of the expected ways with the wings and the trident. And I'm a little bit conflicted about this form at the moment. I say at the moment because all of these things need time to settle in. For example, I was also not 100% on board with Gunko's design at first. I found the whole school uniform aesthetic a little bit bland for One Piece, but I have really grown to like it, especially after seeing her use her abilities. And I'm hoping it's the same for Emu here, because I'm not gonna lie, this whole devil thing, it is a little bit basic aesthetically. It currently lacks that Oda-specific flair of uniqueness. And seeing Emu in this chapter felt a lot like reading Black Clover. That's just what happens to my mind when you combine devils, spell circles, and grimoires. Although to Black Clover's credit, that series actually has some incredibly cool and unique devil designs that aren't quite as stereotypically cartoonish as Emu here. Now what I'm really hoping for is that this cartoonishness devil, it has a purpose, and that this power is something intended to rival Luffy's own cartoon abilities. Because the one thing that did really strike me, as well as struck the arm of Broggy, was Emu opening the grimoire, and of all of the things to pull out of it, he grabs a shotgun. And not just any shotgun either, but like this comically oversized shotgun. And I get that it has to be a certain size to deal substantive damage to a giant, but Emu shooting off Broggy's forearm should not have looked that adorable. And it gave me some really sinister Gear 5th vibes. As Luffy can pull any object out of any place he wants, that is his privilege as the wielder of the powers of a rather imaginative sun god. And right here, Emu is looking like he has that same infinite well of power to pull from, but situated on the other side of the light and dark spectrum. So Wano introduced us to the power of light through Gear 5th, the warm embrace as well as the scorching heat of the imagination of the sun. And this chapter gives us a horrifying look into the chilled depths of the abyss, such as the namesake of this chapter, which is a very cool ability named Domi Reversi, which is Latin for I returned home. Domi is the home part, it's when we get the word domicile, and Reversi is the other part, the to return part, or I returned past tense. In Latin, if a verb ends in I, you can generally recognize it as first person past tense, which you may recognize from the phrase Weni Witty Wiki, which is I came, I saw, I conquered. And with that, I've exhausted what I remember from high school Latin. And I don't really know how deeply I should try to examine what's happening here, because Oda's grasp of English isn't amazing, so I'm not sure how much I should read into his use of Latin. But he could have gone with Domi Reversisti, which would have been you returned home. Granted, it doesn't quite have the same ring to it, and that's probably why Oda went with what he did, but it would make a bit more sense with an attack that targets someone. You, sir, are returning home now. However, what I'm potentially thinking is that because Emu claims to be a god, it is quite fitting to have all of these Latin spells in the first person to make clear who this power is coming from. There's also something in that this could be the first time that Emu has actually been on the surface of the planet in how many centuries? So using the I returned home spell works quite well as a bit of a homecoming for Emu as well. And I also do really like that the more modern English interpretation of the word reversi is visually depicted by having Broggy flipped and reversed into what I imagine could be the abyss, and then having his persona inverted into an evil form, a demonic form, which also becomes insanely larger than a standard giant. Every giant who got Domi reversied in this chapter is now pretty much the same size as Oz or Loki. He's also huge, but without the need for demonic indulgence. Although on that, we could be seeing something so interesting here, because I was about to say that Loki doesn't need any demonic help because he already has the size and his own horns like all ancient giants. But that got my brain thinking, and what we're seeing happening here might be how the ancient giants were originally created in the first place. The idea being that thousands of years ago, a legion of ancient giants were Domi reversied, turning their hearts evil, their heads horny, and their size tres grande. And those demon giants then roamed the world for no other purpose than to cause destruction and spread evil, which is exactly how the tales of Oz are told in the modern day. He was the greatest villain of his era. But these demon giants, they then breed with each other, or actually no, they breed with not each other, and they produce offspring that is, say, only half demon, still pretty bad dudes, but not 100%. And then the next generation after that are only 25% bad dude demons, and we continue along those lines until we reach the modern day, where the demon giant bloodline has become so diluted that they're practically just regular people again. Regular people with some visual leftovers of their heritage and an urge to, every now and then do a bit of the old violence. I'm downplaying that urge, but it could be much worse than that. And that could be what King Harold was grappling with, given that he seems to have known the Holy Knights, if he ever found out that this was his heritage, that the ancient giants come from an unholy spell such as this, then I could see that as a pretty reasonable reason why he would want to rip off his own horns to purge himself of that evil, and also why he would want to rid the ancient giants from Elbaf entirely, because you do have this very literal evil living within your society. But at the same time, that tiny piece of evil is living within completely innocent beings. And as Mr. Dr. Vegapunk proved scientifically, we all have some evil within us, especially you watching this video. You've been very bad. But that evil doesn't always live up to what we've come to expect of evil and can actually end up being rather good. Anyway, that's all just speculation. But our evil giants they so strongly resemble at least Oz and Oz Jr. They even have the chunky underbite happening as well. Now, there is also a trade-off for this power. Emu states that undergoing this process comes at a cost of lifespan, which Emu describes as quite a small portion of life. However, we should remember that Emu is a being who has lived for almost 1,000 years, so what he considers to be a teeny tiny small piece might equate to a rather large piece from our perspective, or even for a giant who lives somewhere between 300 to 400 years on average, that's not even half as much as Emu, and it could even be significantly less than half. So I don't really know if I trust Emu's measurements here. I mean, it's one immortality Brocky. What could it cost? 200 years? And that cost is something to bear in mind, because if we do find a way to revert Dory and Broggy, as well as all of the other giants from the state, that doesn't necessarily mean their life force will come back to them. That price has already been paid, and we don't know what the policy on refunds is at the Emu Mart, but my guess is that all transactions are final. And also, there's a bit of confusion about why the cost actually matters, because the giants have been granted these what have been translated as immortal bodies, although this is another case where I'm not necessarily sure that the word immortal and the concept of immortality is a good choice, and I'm very keen to see how the official translation handles this. But from what I understand, the body itself becomes essentially indestructible. Yes, it can be slightly more permanently hurt by certain abilities, but in this chapter we did see Saint Summers regenerating, so whatever Scopogaban used on him is ultimately a glorified delay tactic. We still can't inflict truly permanent damage on people with these bodies, but having those bodies also doesn't necessarily stop the aging process, which is why we saw Garling as but a young banana, whereas now we see him as a very ripe old man. So you would still be making a fairly large sacrifice to attain this power. However, with that said, there must also be an optional add-on for Emu to halt the aging process and to make that cost not so much of a cost. And in fact, that's probably what's happened with Saint Saturn and the rest of the 5 Elder Stars. Saturn paid the life price for bodily goodness, but Emu then froze his aging, and when Emu decided to unfreeze it, that life cost that Saturn paid finally caught up with him, and he shriveled into a pile of bones and dust, as his debts from the Bank of Life finally caught up with him and sent him into Chapter 11 Life Bankruptcy. And it also gives me a bit of pause for thought for something that I originally thought I really wanted after reading this chapter, which was to see this ability used on one of the Straw Hats, to get an evil Straw Hat. Specifically Luffy. I would love to see an evil devil Luffy using a very dark Gear 5th, although I'm not sure if Oda would ever thematically allow that to happen. Every time there's an opportunity for dark One Piece, Oda likes to remind us that this is a story of hope and optimism, so even if Luffy was subject to this power, he'd probably have the inner strength to maintain himself and just start using wacky cartoon devil powers for the fun of it. But also the life cost also makes it unlikely that any of our Straw Hats are going to succumb to that ability. It is such a high stakes idea that Oda has set up if that cost cannot be refunded, so it really doesn't leave a lot of room for flippant fun conversions. What I do think we could see though is the Devil Giants or even Devil Emu versus Demonio Robin, because in this chapter someone, Robin, for the first time asks where all of the useful crew members are. The Luffys, the Zoros, and the Sanjais. Where are they? Because we're now at the point where we officially really need to call the Avengers in on this. It's like wandering into the final boss without realizing that you haven't healed your main party members. So you stumble into the boss and it's like, oh mate, I have absolutely nothing to fight you with. I'm afraid this is no longer a lower or mid crew issue, although I do love how Robin in this chapter decides that, well, they can't afford bored to just sit and wait for Luffy to show up, and it's implied that she's about to do something potentially drastic because that is what needs to be done. And that thing could be a Demonia, because why not? Demonia Robin looks very aesthetically similar to Devil Gunko, and it might be a fun situation where Imu sees this form and comments on it being a poor imitation. But something that makes me a little bit nervous is that yes, Robin is bound by the powers of Summers, which in this case I think that's very much the preferred state of being, because Jinbei, Brook, Nami, and Usopp are now all essentially under the control of Imu because they're stuck in Gunko's abilities and Imu is controlling Gunko. But here's one way I could see this panning out. If Imu were to use this position to try and do something against Brook, in that kind of situation, Gunko may be able to be all like, no, and to something power of love her way out of this situation, out of his control, if only briefly. Because in terms of the end game here, I'm not sure what else we can do to solve this problem other than to have Gunko reject Imu's presence and for him to, for whatever complicated magical reasons, not be able to use Killingham or Summers as an alternative avatar. Because there is probably something special about Gunko that allows her to be used, and it may be why the Holy Knight is so polite and respectful towards her despite her lack of sainthood, because she can act as the vestal of Imu, which is of course a great honor. Speaking of Killingham though, his abilities got fleshed out a fair bit in this chapter as well. In addition to discovering our endgame RPG boss, Killingham's nightmare creatures also seem to operate on a spawn point system. Because there are these holes all over Elbaf, right? Holes that are constantly pumping out nightmares, and so nothing can really be killed because allegedly the concept of death doesn't exist in dreams. But the solution here is fairly simple. I think every person who's ever played a game knows that we just need to destroy those spawn points. No holes, no monsters. Although there's also a very curious kind of interaction between the abilities of Killingham and Imu in this chapter, and I didn't even notice this at first because I was so focused on the giants. But if you look at the final spread, it's not just the giants with horns and fangs. All of Killingham's nightmare creatures have now been granted horns and fangs as well. And I wonder if that's because they're being juiced up by Imu, or if it's because the nature of the nightmares of those on Elbaf have changed, with the scariest possible things now being mentally registered as having horns and fangs. So in a way, it's the citizens of Elbaf who are controlling what it is they have to go up against. Their fears are directly manifested, meaning that the creatures could, in theory, also be turned into super cutesy versions of what they are if someone like Luffy was able to install Laughter.exe into the OS of Elbaf. Or another alternative would be if Loki comes in to save the day and starts being viewed as a positive force. In that case, the Nightmare Loki could turn into a good guy and start fighting off his fellow nightmares, stuff like that. And the same thing with Nightmare Nika. If the giants see Luffy in Gear 5th acting like a goofy whackpot, then Nightmare Nika could be affected, and we could slowly see the army of nightmares turn into an army of dreams. And not just those two either, because to continue our ongoing C plot of Elbaf, yes, that kid's mother is also in this final spread, fully equipped with horns and fangs, and officially looking even more horrifying than Charlotte Linlin. But if the real mother puts on a solid showing of heroism, then this mother could be on our side as well. With the big thundercloud, that could be a job for Zeus because they look so incredibly similar already. However, the rest of the creatures are admittedly a bit more difficult to come up with an equivalent to, but I do think this is a case where being able to conquer the concept of fear is going to be key to salvation. Salvation for most anyway. We do actually have important character death on our Grand Line Review 2025 bingo card, and this chapter may have given us an unfortunate target for that square, as Imu's orders are to kill Jarl, and he gets the very last panel of the chapter claiming that he will not run away from an invitation to the battle ball. A warrior does not decline a dance with a fair lady of death. And short of the monster trio finishing their picnic and deciding to do something, I'm really not sure what could prevent Jarl from his murder on the dance floor. On the bright side, I do think that this chapter has pretty sufficiently killed the idea that Jarl is a traitor. If he was, then there'd be no reason to go and kill him. So the leaky pipe of suspicion is now ominously dripping traitorous liquid pretty exclusively onto the bald dead head of King Harold at the moment. So I'm very much looking forward to that flashback, and just on flashbacks, I must say that it it is just a little bit annoying that we didn't even come close to addressing the Brook-Gunko connection after being so thoroughly teased in the last chapter, but that's just kind of how One Piece goes sometimes with Oda's leapfrog plot point system. And to be fair, if there was any chapter where we really needed to focus on just one thing, it was this chapter. In most manga, focusing on a single thing per chapter, that sounds pretty standard. One chapter covers one thing in one spot. However, in One Piece, Oda has this really great ability to jump around to several threads within a single chapter and not make it feel too eclectic or jarring. And actually, it usually makes 18 pages every week feel far more substantive than a lot of other manga. But every now and then an event comes along where you cannot afford to switch focus, and this is one of those moments. This is the reveal of potentially the final boss of One Piece, and I do like that after finally stepping into the spotlight, after over 1,100 chapters, Imu refuses to relinquish any stage time whatsoever. Even right at the beginning where we spent a couple of pages focusing on the kids and the adults, Imu was like, I'm not having any of that, and just knocked them all out. Imu is very much like, I'm here now, you are focusing on me. Although the really interesting part is that if this is where Imu chooses to make a stand in the series, and I can't imagine that it is, this just doesn't feel like the right time to be dealing with Imu. I'm thinking this is just a little taste of what's to come, but if it is, then we may not necessarily be looking at our final boss, as we do still have a potentially even greater force of darkness just lurking and waiting for his opportunity to claim the world. Time for Gear Evil. My thoughts exactly. After reaching his peak, I don't know how much further upwards we can push Luffy's powers, but what we can do is we can expand laterally. Like how Gear 4th got a bunch of variants with Tank Man and Snake Man, and look, at this point in One Piece, Eiichiro Oda can make a reasonable excuse to do whatever the crap it is he wants to do with Luffy. So the only real question we have to ask ourselves here is whether or not Oda thinks that a cartoon Devil Luffy would be a fun idea to draw, and I am personally hoping that he does think that. Imu can physically turn his enemies into allies, while Luffy can spiritually turn his enemies into allies. And someone else in the comments replied to this with domination versus liberation, which I really like. As identified all the way back in the pre-time skip era by Mr. Mihawk, Luffy has the most dangerous ability on the planet, which is to turn everyone around him into an ally. He just has a certain charm that can warm people's hearts and make them believe in something better than the thing it is they have right now. So it is quite rightfully horrifying in this chapter to see Imu being capable of that same power. Because it may not feel like it, but we need that power to win almost every conflict that the Straw Hats have ever engaged in. There's a lot of emphasis put on the individual strength of the crew as well as their belief in Luffy, but the stuff that really wins battles are the small elements. Like Saitama joining the raid and turning all the Smile users, or Gyatso and his men on Dressrosa protecting Luffy from Doflamingo for 10 minutes because he needed a sweet Haki recharge, or Pecom's flipping sides at the last second on Whole Cake Island to save Luffy's life after the fight against Katakuri, and even Dory and Brogy. They've been turned into demons now, not good, because they were essential for our success on Egghead Island. The Straw Hats are the bricks, but all of these minor characters are the mortar that holds everything together. Without them, our crew would have gotten absolutely nowhere, and without them in the future, they won't be going anywhere. This has been the true X factor that has allowed Luffy to get this far. It's an effect that no other pirate can replicate. With the possible exception of maybe Blackbeard, but Imu possessing the inverse of this power to take command of people against their will is an infinitely bigger problem than you may initially realize. Because if Imu can remove our allies, if Imu can remove our mortar, then our Straw Hat house has already collapsed. So that fictional idea shakes me to my very real core. But this is also the inverse of something that I've been talking about ever since we saw Bonnie access her Nika form. I suspected, and still do suspect, that Luffy is capable of giving anyone access to their most free incarnation, and that by the end of One Piece we are going to have a ton of joy people just bouncing all over the planet. But Imu here is showing the opposite, that he can give everyone access to their most trapped incarnations, their most confined, their most not free. So look, I'm not sure, is our way out of this for Luffy to get Dory and Brogy to achieve their Nika forms and liberate themselves from Imu? I know the idea sounds completely absurd at this stage, but I'm not sure what else overcomes maximum confinement other than maximum liberation. And there's also, I think, a comparison drawn between Imu's abilities and Luffy's Gear 5th in Broggy's dialogue in this chapter. After being transformed into a demon, Broggy says that it feels like he can do anything and that it's exhilarating, which is very similar to what Luffy said in chapter 1044 after unlocking Gear 5th. He said, "Ooh, I can do everything I want to do," which makes what Imu's doing here that much more dangerous, because he is giving you a false sense of freedom. He is injecting you with power juice and giving you a rush so big that you don't realize the walls that have been built around you. And just a minor note of conspiracy here. Did Mr. Mihawk comment on Luffy's ability all of the way back during Marineford because he knows something about what Imu can do? And having seen what Imu can do, is he seeing what Luffy does and going, that's pretty powerful? I mean, look, probably not, because this idea hinges entirely on the fact that Mihawk and Imu have the same eyes, but it's just something to throw out there and think about. I think the Reversi part of Domi Reversi is also heavily based on the board game Reversi. Alright, I 100% missed this because in Australia we do have this game, but it's called Othello. But this makes infinitely more sense now because of the part where Dory gets transformed and then everyone standing in between Dory and Broggy, they instantly get flipped as well, which are the rules of the game. Any discs in a straight line between two discs of the opposing color get flipped, and that is what automatically happens to the giant standing in between Dory and Broggy, which is very fun because Imu's powers do have rules in this case, and given that this game has 2 players, that means it may be possible to use those rules against Imu strategically, to be able to flip the giants back to their white side somehow. And this arc could really end up just turning into one big board game. And the fact that Imu's abilities are based on a game does add more to the idea that Imu is a child frozen in time. Although in this chapter, I must say that Imu handles himself with quite a degree of maturity, instantly recognizing what the best way to handle this situation is, which I like, because if you're gonna have a character who is, the ruler of the world, then that character better have the brain to back that up. Seeing how demonic Imu can be in this chapter, you can only imagine how terrifying Joy Boy must have been with his use of Haki and Gear 5th to be able to scare and traumatize such a character. Alright, so this is a bold prediction based on the nothing we know right now, but I feel like Imu is going to turn out to be a lot less threatening once we really dive down to his core. Sort of like the Wizard of Oz, a man behind the curtain. Although I might be a bit biased here at the moment because I've recently heard that there is a life-size Imu plushie being released, and it is 92 centimeters tall, which is about 3 feet for the Americans, Myanmar, and Liberia, the only 3 countries in the world to not use the proper system. But 92 centimeters, it is not a lot, and so bro is like this tall. It doesn't even reach the camera. It's this tall. Imu is about this tall. Are we not going to talk about how Harold may have been Imu'd and reversied? And that's why Loki and perhaps even Jarl had to kill him, even at his own behest fighting against the demon. The damage in the castle was pretty cray-cray. So that is incredibly possible. I guess it would mean that either Gunko or another avatar of Imu has been to Elbaf in order to carry that out. And I would get why neither Loki nor Jarl would have spoken the truth of what happened, because we cannot have the people remembering Elbaf's revolutionary and beloved king as a vicious demon. But it would imply that Loki and Jarl actually found a way to kill someone with one of these immortal bodies, which I'm not too sure about. I'm also hoping that it's not that, because Dude being controlled by an evil entity is kind of a cop-out answer. I get that it would keep the legacy of Harold pure, but I want a bit more substance to it than that. Oda's writing tends to hit hardest when he's able to create a very human reason behind the very tragic actions, and we've already done the whole being controlled by an evil entity thing with King Riku on Dressrosa. Doflamingo puppeteered him into slaughtering his people, so I'm not hugely keen to go down the same path with Harold. I'm definitely hoping for a more unique situation. But the closer that One Piece does get to this flat-out good versus evil concept, the more likely it does become that, sure, Harold being Domi reversied could be the answer. And this even opens up the very, very awkward discussion of the 5 elders potentially having once been people who were good at heart before Imu came to the throne. We don't know the specifics of their transformation. It might not be the same thing at all, but Imu can corrupt people's hearts in the same way that Luffy can liberate them. And that means that someone like St. J. Garcia Saturn could have at one point been a humble scientist just looking to help the world and create some smiles, much like Vegapunk. But after being corrupted by evil, he became obsessed with creating diseases and inflicting nothing but pain on the world. I'm not sure if that's off the table. And there may be a future where we have a flashback of the 5 Elder Stars and we actually start feeling kinda sorry for them. Robin is looking like the crew member most likely to be Domi Reversied. Alright, so here's what happens. Imu flips her and she comes out looking exactly the same. Nothing's changed. Because she's already seen the greatest evil that this world has to offer. And then Imu makes the Enel face after meeting his natural counter. I think Imu will definitely be used as a comedic villain to fight against Luffy. When I first saw Gear 5th versus Kaido, I immediately thought, oh, so he's Bugs Bunny now. And this chapter finally gives us his double-barrel shotgun-wielding rival, Elmer Fudd. You know, now that you've said it, I need to see this happen. I didn't even go there with the shotgun, but mate, you are so right. If our destiny is to go full Looney Tunes, and I would love to see it, I'm all on board. And it would work because Imu is very much the straight man in this piece. He's taking things seriously, where we seriously, which is Elmer Fudd's role, whilst Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck tend to steal all the comedic moments.
I'm giving you till the count of 5 to apologize to me publicly for calling me stupid. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
The bit that confuses me is why Imu is giving attention to Elbaf whilst Marijois is under attack and on fire. So that's a very good question, and I would definitely love to know more about what's happening there. But part of this may be because of the mindset of being a god or trying to project yourself as a god, and how not godly of an act it is to admit defeat and retreat in the face of these mere mortals. If Imu rocked up to Elbaf and was all like, you guys, come help me. The bad people are burning my city and I need Saint Summers to help me, a god. If Imu was to do that, then it just wouldn't look very good. So Imu has to aggressively defend his status as a god, even in the face of multiple crises. But what I'm also thinking is that Imu's solution is actually quite efficient. He's completely flipped this conflict, and he probably believes that settling it won't take too long, after which point the plan may be to teleport the demon giants to the Holy Land in order to have them help fight whoever's attacking them. The fact that Sanji is unable to sense Robin and Nami being captured and hurt shows just how big Elbaf is. So yeah, usually Sanji does have this special ability to sense when and where a woman is in danger. We've seen him use it many times, notably with Tashigi on Punk Hazard, and most recently with Bonnie on Egghead Island. He calls it his Lady Radar, and it does have a pretty incredibly impressive range. But Elbaf is so big that right now the Straw Hats are technically in 2 different worlds. All of the stuff happening with Imu and the Holy Knights is happening in the Sun World, whilst Team Loki are in the Underworld. And I do quite like this because it's a pretty great way of honoring the inspiration of Yggdrasil and the separation of the 9 worlds in Norse mythology. What are the chances Jewelry Bonnie could use her Devil Fruit to change the giants to normal? With how wild this arc has been, I feel like that seems like one of the only solutions to the life cost. So I'd say the chances that she could are pretty good, but the chances that she will are pretty bad. Because Bonnie is one of those awkward Trafalgar Law kind of characters that Oda needs to put some big barriers around to stop them automatically being the solution to every problem. Although it would be very interesting to see Bonnie try and use her powers on Tori and Broggy only for them to not work, because perhaps devil fruits cannot override the power of an actual devil. However, if Bonnie does end up at least seeing the demon giants, then she could probably use her abilities to make alternate demonic versions of everyone, because she knows that it's possible now, she believes in it. And when Bonnie transforms people, they get their alternate future bodies, but they keep their current minds. So there's something to be said for transforming people into immortal demonic forms. It does sound pretty useful, but it probably won't happen. I'm still interested in why Gunko's hair grew when she's being possessed by Imu. In all her other appearances, she had short hair. Maybe Imu just prefers women with long hair. Although what I will say for the long hair is that artistically it does mature Gunko's appearance a fair bit. The short hair combined with the school uniform does give off a very juvenile vibe, whereas the long hair adds those implied years of growth and makes us take this form a bit more seriously as the supreme authority of the planet. This is where we need Vice Admiral Suru to wash the evil right back out of these naughty, naughty demon giants. Suru does seem like a pretty natural counter to this. In case you don't know or don't remember, Vice Admiral Suru has the Wash Fruit, turning her into a laundry human who's able to clean the hearts of the people who she hangs out to dry. So a lot of the miscellaneous pirates she runs into end up becoming model citizens afterwards. However, it is specifically mentioned that Suru can only clean out a limited amount of evil. So if someone is real bad, then it would be like trying to clean a sewer with a toothbrush and a tiny little thing of toothpaste that you got from an airport bathroom. Not very very effective. So I don't think she'd be able to do much against anyone targeted by Imu. It's too much evil. We're talking 100% evil, and Tsuru could probably only wash away like 1%, which it isn't nothing, and it does open the door of potential. But she's not here anyway, so no, it doesn't matter. Yamato's cover story is not over yet. Ulti is holding the hat that Yamato said they delivered to Kawamatsu. There's still room for shenaniganry. Yeah, it is definitely not over. When cover stories end, they say final part. Although this one's a bit deceptive because it does say pilgrimage complete. But Yamato's journey around Wano is not complete yet. If you look at Kinemon's travel itinerary, the X marks where we currently are in Hakumai to deliver Yasuo's blade. And after that, Yamato still has to go through Ringo and then back to the flower capital. And before that, as the commenter said, we've got to give this hat to Kawamatsu, who is in Hakumai. So I imagine that we'll be seeing him on the next cover. Does this mean Imu is the forest god from the second world in the Harley text? Because he tamed/called demons? Alright, so demon taming is mentioned in the Harley text. The second world text begins with, "Within the void there was a breath. The forest god tamed demons, and the sun spread the fires of war." However, this may not necessarily refer to Imu. It could also be someone or something taming the demonic remnants that were created by Imu or whoever held these powers prior to Imu. As in, all of these demons already existed because of these powers, but another entity managed to break through to them to remove some of that demonicosity. Which I only say because the first world also seems to be covered in demons and enslavement as well. And in fact, there are these shadowy demonic creatures seen in the Elbaf mural, one of which is suspected to be Imu, but all three of them could end up being demons created by Imu and this ability. But also in the Harley text, it mentions the Earth God and the Sea God, the latter of which I think fits Imu a bit better at the moment, because at the end of the second world, the Sea God storms, which very much sounds like the Great Flood of the Void Century. In total, this many gods are mentioned, 4. We have the earth, the forest, the sea, and the sun. And we know who the sun god is, and we also have a pretty okay idea for the sea god. I'd be surprised if it wasn't Imu. But when it comes to earth and forest, it looks like we do still have 2 more lurking legends out there. Mr. One Piece / Hunter x Hunter commentator man, I'm surprised you didn't compare Imu's grimoire to Crollo's Nen ability. Alright, so for non-Hunter x Hunter fans, firstly, watch the anime or read the manga, you'll like it. But secondly, this refers to a character named Crollo Lucifer, who can steal the powers of others after completing an arse ton of painful restrictions, and then what he can do, right, is open his funky book to any page and activate the ability on that page. I talk about this a lot on my New World Review channel, which is all about Hunter x Hunter, but Imu may be doing something similar here, opening the book to a certain page to use the ability on that book. So for example, we flip to the page with Domi Reversi. Out comes the 2 items needed to start the game, a stabby knife and huge shotgun. And it's probably at this point that I should bring this up. 10 years ago, it was alleged that the ending of One Piece was leaked by a Shueisha employee. And 10 years ago, the ending did exist because Oda has told the ending of One Piece to every editor he's had ever since the very beginning. And this was completely dismissed in 2015 because it just sounded ridiculous, remembering that at the time we were just finishing Dressrosa. But this leaked ending stated that the climax of One Piece would feature a huge war against the quote devil and his army versus Luffy and his extended fleet of pirates. And furthermore, it stated that this devil would have access to all devil fruit powers, which I wouldn't put past Imu having within his grimoire. And mate, I have to say that this leak isn't looking anywhere near as insane as it sounded 10 years ago, and there's also a lot more to it than what I've said, many more details, so please do keep an eye on this here channel, as a video will be released analyzing the full quote-unquote leak, and just beware because yes, this could all be a bunch of nothing, but it could also be a bit of something. And if you click on that video, the ending of One Piece may actually be spoiled for you. The monster trio are back in action, and it is finally time to free Loki and have both sun gods head up to the sun world to bring about a double dawn to the ever-darkening Elbaf. Although the very first character that we see in this chapter is actually Kashi of all people, who is one of the 2 giants who was guarding Enies Lobby. And he is a bit of a heartbreaking character to have pleading with his captains to break free of this madness. Because remember, this dude was willing to give 100 years of his life, about a third of a giant's expected lifespan just to secure the freedom of Dory and Broggy. Remembering that the world government had told Oimo and Kashi that they had captured Dory and Broggy, which was a lie, but it still gets me because Kashi was willing to pay such a high price for the freedom of his captains, and now they've just been enslaved. And Oda could have used any giant at all to deliver this dialogue, but he gave it to Kashi, and that hurt so much more. It was a very good little micro decision. And I have to say, I'm quite conflicted with Mr. Dory and Mr. Broggy at the moment, because the part of me that reads One Piece for the spectacle really loves what's happening here. They both look insanely cool and intimidating as demons, and I really want to see them go and smash some stuff, but also it does hurt me on the inside to see them abandoning the core principles of their culture. It's those principles that initially enamored us to the giants all of the way back in the Little Garden, where for one thing, pride and honor were concepts prioritized over everything. Strength without honor was not true strength, and if you did attain strength without honor, then that was nothing to be proud about. And so seeing our boys abandon all of that for just a little power boost, it feels wrong. I don't like it, especially with the idea that after gaining all of this strength, the first thing they're gonna do is use it on a withered old man, and that they are more than happy to do it. With the giants, gaining strength is meant to be for fighting stronger foes, not weaker foes. There is no honor in battle against a weaker foe. And that is exactly what Imu wants later on in this chapter. Imu states that the plan is to shatter the spirit of Elbaf, to crush the heart of its culture, and I really like that sort of ambition from an antagonist. It's the sort of thing that really gripped me with Orochi of all people, because sure, he was never a physical threat, but what he represented was so much worse. Orochi was a slow-acting poison gradually decaying the spirit of Wano, and that arc was about overcoming the relentless assault on that spirit. And so what's exciting about Imu is that we've got all of the best qualities of Orochi, which is not that many, but with Imu we've got none of the garbage. And in the space of a chapter and a bit, Imu has constructed a threat to the very soul of Elbaf, and that level of threat took Orochi over 20 years to build. But Imu's just gone and done it by taking out a board game to play. And this chapter does appear to confirm that Domi Reversi is indeed a game played by the rules of Reversi or Othello. So my joke last week about Elbaf turning into one big board game actually kinda seems to be coming true. But this is good, very good, because board games have rules. And so with said rules, we should be able to flip our giants back. And someone recently commented on one of my videos that if we need 2 white pieces to start flipping the black giants back, then we do have Luffy and Bonnie who can both access their Nika forms. So if we can plonk an affected giant between the two of them, I wonder if we could even start to create an army of Nika giants. Demonic Dory says a couple of interesting things before we move on though. The first is that he rather boldly claims that they no longer have a need for gods anymore, and I can't help but feel that Imu might eventually have a little something to say about that. Our giants are probably a little bit too high on their hit of demon powers right now, but realistically, one way or another, gods control their fate from here on out, either through the self-proclaimed god that is Imu or the destined sun god that is Luffy. But either way, Imu's powers continue to be absolutely fascinating. Something that might get overlooked in this chapter is that Dory also says that it's time to call forth a new era of war. And this is actually a reference to something that we were told in chapter 1137, when it was said that King Harold ripped out his horns because ancient giants reminded him of the era of war. And part of that scene was this mental image of a demonic giant that looks a lot like what we're having to deal with right now, just without the wings. But also something that I initially did not notice about that panel is that the ancient giant appears to be standing over what looks to be a fairly advanced city. And in that same chapter, Shamrock states that the quote, vicious warriors of Elbaf actually conquered the New World long ago, which I believe is referring to the era of war, where the giants just set out and took the entirety of the New World for themselves. So what Dory is saying in this chapter is that yes, it is time for something world domination. And I really want Oda to dive into this a lot more, but there is a small section where we see Usopp's reaction to Dory and Broggy having been transformed, and he is completely distraught and even tearing up at what the two people he admires most in the world have become. And having said everything I did about Luffy and Bonnie potentially being the rules of the game to flip the giants, I do wonder if this might even actually be a job for Usopp, because he is rather traditionally the man who makes the alliances with giants on behalf of the Straw Hats. Usopp admires the giants so much that he's always able to speak their language and earn their respect. He's the one who got Oimo and Kashi on side, and he also got Haruden to praise him as a god. So we could be in for a rather touching moment where Usopp is able to break through to Dory and Broggy even briefly with the profound spirit of Elbaf that has all but been erased in these demonic forms. And the more and more giants that get converted into demons, the one person on this island who most embodies the true spirit of Elbaf may end up being Usopp, and it may be up to him to rescue this spirit. And I really hope that Oda has something planned in that general direction, because there has never been a better opportunity to display the inner strength and spirit of Usopp than right here and right now, with the giants being forced to abandon everything that he admired about them. Although not all giants, because Bent's mother is also living up to that spirit in this chapter, having survived Imu's burst of Conqueror's Haki, and she is vowing to come and save her son. As is Ripley, she's now on the way to Colin, so we could also be seeing Elbaf's most terrifying hidden power rather soon, an army of mothers and housewives. But rather crazily, this chapter also grants us our first glimpse at human Saint Gillingham. I guess more accurately, this is his hybrid form. He's a centaur now, and I know that this is extremely unlikely to happen, but given his newfound centaurosity, I think that this is now a very appropriate time to see a post-time skip Frankie Centaur. Yes, take Killingham on with that. But this reveal has completely changed my impression of St. Killingham. It's like we're not even seeing the same character anymore. Before, I wasn't sure if Killingham was really living up to what it was to have the title of a saint and take on the qualities of a world noble, because in his, I guess we'll call it full beast mode, he seemed to be such a lovely, derpy, kind of good guy who was just caught up with a bad crowd and being used for bad things. Which firstly, I had assumed that that was his hybrid form, but that being the full beast form makes a lot more sense because the Kirin, it is a very kind creature. It's said that a Kirin takes great care never to tread on living things and even manages to walk on blades of grass without trampling them. So in the full beast mode, St. Killingham does appear to be this quite likable and rather gentle guy despite doing all of the things it is that he's doing. But mate, his actual body could not be more different. He has instantly flipped into a sadistic bloodthirsty, and if it wasn't for the more literal demons currently on Elbaf, I would also be tempted to describe Killingham as a demon as well. Having the sharp teeth definitely doesn't help with that impression. And you know, usually in this situation, I would start suspecting as to whether or not Killingham is a fishman or part fishman. Oftentimes, these spiky teeth do lead us to very underwater origins, like we had with Dellinger, Jack, and Sasaki, who were all at least part fishmen, but I just can't see the world nobles incorporating anyone, even part fishmen, into their society. The prejudice, it is just so strong. Killingham does look a lot like Madame Charlie, I would say, and there is a close-up panel of Killingham that may add to this idea. I think this is an illusion, but if you look at his neck on the right of the close-up, there are some lines that do look like they could potentially be gills, but that is the wonderful illusion of black and white. It's more likely that these are the fabric lines of his neck ruff, which is more obviously seen in the full body image. But I have also seen some others already point out that Killingham looks a bit similar to the female Holy Knight that we saw in Kuma's flashback during the God Valley incident, which I do agree with from the one image we have of her in the manga. That could be Killingham's mother or otherwise close relative. Due to the rather inbred nature of the world nobles, there's always a good case to be made that anyone is related to anyone. But also with Garling and Shamrock, it does appear that being a Holy Knight is something that may run in the family, and I do wonder if the 19 families that chose to settle on Marijois have each offered members to serve the Holy Knights. Although we actually recently saw this woman in the anime, and her color scheme has gone a bit wild. From having very clearly dark hair in the manga, the anime has gone and made her crazy blonde. Garling level of blonde, which is to me the one hair color a character can't have if their hair was originally drawn as pitch black by the author. Although the anime have been making a lot of crazy choices with colors lately. I'm not a big fan of Garling's outfit either. The hair, however, well, that has given us quite the gift, as he shall now be known as Figalund Bananaling. But with Killingham, it is pretty insane just how immediately he became more threatening than Saint Summers. And he does have that vibe of, you know, overconfident youth about him. So I don't think he should be all that difficult to defeat on his own. He seems too confident. And especially if we are getting Loki involved, which it looks like we finally are as we get an update on what's happening in the underworld. And this event has given us something that I was afraid we might never get, which is a legitimately good reason reason to free Loki. Throughout this whole arc, I have been ever so skeptical about how Oda was going to get him out of those chains, and I've never really been completely satisfied by Luffy's assertion that, nah mate, this Loki is a pretty decent guy, and if not, I'm gonna kick him in the nuts and it'll all be good. It just seemed like a real good way to turn the entirety of Elbaf against us, and to have Loki go on to cause destruction that might have been prevented by just not being an idiot, and in which case, you know, Luffy's now directly responsible for that destruction. I mean, I do trust Luffy's intuition, but I'm also very glad that we now have a much more amazing reason to let him loose. Kind of like when the citizens of Fishman Island were begging for Luffy to come and save them, even though they thought that that salvation came in the form of destroying the entire island. I think it is definitely much better to let Loki loose, even knowing that Ragnarok could result from it, rather than leave everything in the hands of Imu. And Scopogaban actually plays a very important part in all of this. The burst of Haki, yes, it is rather fierce, but without seeing the injured Scopogaban, I'm not sure if Luffy or Harudin would have taken this situation seriously enough to consider freeing Loki. But with the very allegedly second strongest member of the Pirate King's crew taken out of action, and him not being able to actually say how he was taken out of action, there is definitely a much stronger case to be made for freeing Loki. I also do have to love the absolute pettiness of Scopogaban to insist that he was the second strongest member of Roger's crew, after being accused of probably third. It's very Zoro and Sanji coded, which means that Rayleigh and Gaban very likely had that same rivalry together, and that is something that I would love to see in a future flashback. I feel like Oda has been very guarded about showing anything to do with Scopogaban, even in flashbacks that he's involved in, and that's probably because he didn't want to give away anything about the character. But now that we know exactly who this guy is, I need to see some early adventures of the more dysfunctional Roger Pirates. I also love that Loki is the only one smiling after feeling Imu's throbbing Haki. Harudin, he's shitting himself, he's completely out of his depth and he knows it. But even Luffy, he's sweating here and he's all like, alright, I understand, this is a bad situation, guys. And so the only one in this group currently acting like the sun god it is that he claims to be is Loki. He's the guy bringing the laughter and the joy to this situation. And I know that's probably because Loki sees this as his ticket to freedom, but it is still very interesting to see someone thematically challenge Luffy's series status like this. Because remember, what's coming up won't just be a struggle against Imu. This is going to be about deciding who gets to take on the role of the sun god. Not that Luffy cares at all about any of that, but Loki does, and we as readers know that it's important. As does Oda. He knows that it's important. In fact, he's the one telling us and consistently drawing all of these comparisons. Like the very short flashback in chapter 1136, where Oda drew Loki in the trademark Luffy Gear 5th pose and also made his silhouette particularly cartoonish. So I am really looking forward to seeing more of Loki's take on Nika, but also his devil fruit. I honestly keep forgetting that Loki even has a devil fruit, we just never address it. But that may be part of Loki's confidence here as well, because we do have a logistical issue to solve, which is that the new giant warrior pirates came down to the underworld on their ship, the Great Eric, but they came crashing down because the island clouds that the Great Eric uses to sail apparently disappear in the underworld. So they can't get back up using that ship, they need another option. I don't know how many of those there are, so maybe Loki's legendary devil fruit is going to be the only solution that makes that work. But also some tragedy, because in this chapter we have another appearance, or I guess appearance is the wrong word, but Mossa pops back up into the story. And if you only read the Viz translation, then I'm referring to Shaggy, aka Loki's only friend who frequently speaks with him on the snail phone. And Mossa is essentially calling to say that yes, this is the end of their very strange phone snail based relationship, which means that Mossa is very potentially Jarl. That's always been the most reasonable answer right from the beginning, because whilst Mossa is translated as Shaggy in English, it's based on the Mossa Mossa onomatopoeia, which means to be hairy, or even more specifically, to be thickly bearded. We have to say that nobody does a beard thicker than Jarl, and also Mossa speaking through the Denden Mushi even looks like Jarl. And so I guess the logic from here is that Jarl is calling Loki knowing that he's about to die and just wanting to say goodbye, as Dory and Broggy have been Domi reversied and ordered to cut off Jarl's head and quote, hold it aloft, and Jarl, being the great warrior he is, has refused refused to run from battle combat. However, there is a pretty big however here. This chapter is very interesting because it actually goes back in time, and the conversation between Loki and Mossa actually happens before Dory and Broggy are ordered to kill Jarl, because we see that burst of Conqueror's Haki that Emu used at the beginning of the last chapter. So at this point in the timeline, Jarl doesn't necessarily know that he's being targeted, so you could argue that there's no reason to call up Loki and say goodbye. And also the conversation that happens itself is just a bit weird. It's all very ambiguous and it'll make sense in retrospect. But Loki thinks something about, oh, some nasty business coming up in a certain place. There are definitely other theories for this, but I think that Jarl is still currently the most likely candidate, and maybe he could just feel when Emu appeared and didn't need to hear that his death was ordered to know that he would be leaving this world today. But again, Mossa being Jarl has always made the most sense. Might not be true, might be. But again, Mossa being Jarl also has the fact that it's only Loki and Jarl who know the truth about what happened to Harold. So they have this little secret between each other. So of course they're playing their sneaky little phone games. But also something very cool and rather subtle in this chapter is that it looks like Luffy's gotten an upgrade, or he's starting the process to get an upgrade. As when Chopper Gaban fall from the Sun World, Luffy instinctually knows that it's Chopper and some other dude, which no one else picks up on. In fact, they don't even realize that living things fell at all. They just hear a noise. And no one questions why Luffy seems to know so much, but something is definitely being unlocked here. Like how towards the end of pre-time skip One Piece, Luffy started using increasingly powerful bursts of Conqueror's Haki unintentionally. And whilst this supernatural sense of perception does seem to fit into the realm of observation Haki, I would be much more excited if this was Luffy starting to ramp up his voice of all things ability. That would explain why no one else even came close to perceiving this, because Zoro and Sanji are both pretty phenomenal observation users, but they do not have the special voice powers. And if the seed is being planted here, then this may turn into an integral ability in the ensuing fight against Emu. For example, let's say something like Luffy meeting Emu, coming face to face with the god of the planet, but instead of addressing Emu, Luffy is hearing the voice of Gunko yelling out to be saved. Now that is a realm that we could potentially be diving into, but you let me know what you think about all of the madness of this chapter in the comments below. The Reversi/Othello angle seems like a very natural fit for Usopp to make his mark on Elbaf. I agree. I think this might be a very decent fit as well, because Usopp is part of the crew that post-time skip just can't engage in straight up punch fights in the new world. And just like Sanji said all the way back during Enisobi, Usopp needs to do what no one else on the crew can do and contribute with his own unique skill set, and strategic board games seems very much like something within Usopp's comfort zone. Also, Robin, she would be a great choice to tackle something like this as well. But I like Usopp because Emu has begun a direct assault on the very spirit of Elbaf, and as we'll talk about later with the kids in this video, this fight is no longer about strength, it is about having belief in the heart of Elbaf. And whilst this may very well be cut, because I really want Usopp to have a bigger role in this arc, I still think that there is no one better placed to uphold the spirit of Elbaf than Usopp. Big Daddy Grand Line Man, are you not going to talk about what Emu said about King Harold? How it basically confirms that Harold was a big bad person, and Loki is probably in the right for killing him? You see, that's interesting because I actually got the opposite impression, that Harold's blunder refers to a decision that may have been deliberately made against Emu. Although I have to say I think my mind is a bit poisoned here because of Emu's use of the word blunder, as that is how he describes the poneglyphs being scattered throughout the world by Nefertari Lily. It was Lily's blunder. Thanks to her blunder that day, all of the things are happening today. And I don't see Lily as having been a big bad person, even though she may have outwardly portrayed herself as an ally of Emu. And this whole blunder thing could refer to something like Harold breaking free of Emu's mind control, even briefly, or someone else breaking him out of that control. And then let's say in that brief moment, Harold pleads with Loki to kill him. Because if not, then Emu is going to keep control of Harold and Elbaf will fall. And as I've said before, I do hope it's not something that blanket good and evil can explain, like, oh, Harold was bad because he got controlled by Bad Man. And I do hope that Harold has a more interesting reason to have been working with the world government as we suspect. But you know, in this chapter, we also had Haradin and Loki arguing about Harold's death, and Loki Loki does say something along the lines of, hey, brother, he was my father as well, which says to me that killing Harold was probably quite a difficult thing for Loki to do, because he still values that father-son connection. One big point against the Jarl Ismossa theory is that Gerd and Goldberg didn't recognize the voice from the snail. You'd think they would recognize the voice of one of Elbaf's greatest legends. I mean, I could also say the same thing about Loki. You would think that Loki would recognize Jarl's voice, but this is another thing that I saw just a little bit differently. When Mossa calls, yes, we do get reaction shots of both Gerd and Goldberg, and they're quite subdued and contemplative. It's really hard to know what to make of these shots because there is no surprise whatsoever, and that almost makes this whole situation even more suspicious. You'd think that at least one of them would have had a stronger reaction to some dude calling Loki in the underworld, whether it's Jarl or not. But the way they're looking at Loki on the snail phone, it's almost as if they both know exactly what's going on and they are choosing to play dumb. Which is the sort of thing I could see happening in the One Piece, that these two have discovered Jarl's secret conversations at some stage and potentially even overheard the truth of the Harold situation, but have kept it to themselves because of something hard in pride and honor. I don't know, a lot just seems to be lining up for it to be Jarl at the moment, but I also concede there is quite a bit that doesn't necessarily add up. Including the fact that, yes, in chapter 1134, Loki does state that he has never met Mossa, which, well, that just wouldn't be true if it was Jarl. And the only way for this to work would be if Loki doesn't know that he's speaking to Jarl, and Jarl has been secretly keeping him company because he feels bad about what happened, or whatever reason of convenience it is that Oda comes up with. But we should definitely explore other options as well, because there are too many factors here that are pointing towards a non-Jarl answer. So with that, the answer could also be that Loki is talking to someone significantly further away. And one location that we do know is having a pretty rough time right now is the Holy Land of Manijwa, which might make sense with how Loki refers to Mossa. This doesn't get translated into English at all, but Loki uses a special honorific with Mossa, which is Ko, so he calls him Mossa Ko. Ko being a very old term of respect for nobilities or high-ranking military personnel, which is one reason why it would work well for Jarl, because there wouldn't be anyone more worthy of that honorific on Elbaf than him. But unless Loki was using it sarcastically, whoever he's talking to would be a pretty big deal. And if we are talking about the Holy Lands, then Loki's friend could even be a world noble. Maybe someone who is infected with the Don Quixote Moscard way of thinking and is now actively working against their fellow world nobles. But as for why such a person would or even could have reached out to Loki, I have no idea, which is why I still kind of default to Jarl. But I will take some time to mention other ideas though. One of my favorites is that Mossa is actually the owl in the library. There's definitely something set up with that bad winged boy. And it's also been suggested that it could be Morley speaking to Loki, and this is primarily because Morley's epithet is Morley of fur, and while the beard isn't anywhere near as Mossa as Jarl's, it is still pretty Mossa, so the codename could work. There would also be something nice about a giant from another kingdom reaching out to Elbaf for whatever reason, and Morley calling now would be because of something happening with the Revolutionary Army, like pillaging a certain Holy Land. Got my hands full here, Loki, can't chat. And the Revolutionary Army did have a mission to Manijwa during the Reverie, and maybe that's why Loki said that, quote, "If I were there in your place, I'd have razed it to the ground and killed them all instead." And Loki also went on to say, "And that's why you're so weak, Shaggy. Listen, you don't want to let those fools get away. You gotta put them down for good or they'll come back for vengeance." I guess referring to not wiping out all of the world nobles while they had the chance, maybe? Or Mossa could even be a much more unexpected person. I like the theory that Mossa may be Shirahoshi, based off Roger telling Neptune that his daughter would be, quote, Shaggy. She could possibly have been confiding in another member of royalty about her pressures as a princess while keeping her identity hidden for safety. Blackbeard could very well be invading Fishman Island as we speak. He certainly could be. And Roger certainly did say that, didn't he? This was when Neptune found out that he was going to be a father before he even had a wife. And Roger reassured Neptune that he wouldn't be back in the future to, quote, kidnap your hairy daughter. And look, I don't hate this idea. Shirahoshi and Loki would would have quite a bit in common, what with both of them being royalty and both of them having been locked up for big parts of their life. And Mossa does often speak about being scared and trembling and all that, and that is very Shirahoshi language. And the co-honorific would also make sense to use for Shirahoshi, of course, but I do think that the name Mossa is a bit of a stretch for Shirahoshi, and the Dendenmushi appearance still gets me. These psychic snails take on the physical qualities of those who speak through them, and the last time we saw her, Shirahoshi did not have the world's most Mossa of beards. But then you can also make the argument that this beard is a special feature of this specific kind of Dendenmushi, because they are identified as cold-resistant types. So the thick beard might not represent the speaker in this case, it might represent the equipment, the snail itself. So in conclusion, Mossa could be anyone, and we've gotten nowhere. It only occurs to me now that Rhodes' role-playing castle at the start of Elbaf now feels like a slight microcosm of what's happening now. Rhodes enslaved a bunch of humans to serve as pieces in his game, which we're seeing Emu do in a much more severe manner. Yeah, that's very right. The Legoland opening does have quite a bit in common with what we're seeing right now. Rhodes, of course, cosplayed as his sun god OC in a black robe, looking all demonic, and now we have a very horrifying Emu claiming dominion over the island and playing with its citizens like toys, just like how Rhodes toyed with all the humans he'd abducted and trapped in his diorama. And come to think of it, whatever happened to all those people? Did they ever get free? There were a lot of people that Rhodes kept kidnapped in there. He called them live dolls, which is so insanely creepy and a great reminder that Rhodes is such a disturbing weirdo who's been rehabilitated into a comic relief character. From what I remember, Luffy punched a hole in the wall and all of the other live dolls said that they would use this chance to escape while they can. Escape to where though? Castle was in the underworld. Good luck, miscellaneous humans. But also all of Rhodes' pets, these gigantic nightmare creatures, are now appearing in a much more horrifying form through Killingham's devil fruit abilities, and I guess if we continue down this line of similarities, then Emu will eventually become a big old giant just like Rhodes, and then Emu's also going to end up being punished by his equivalent of Gerd for being very weird and a little bit mean. Harridan says they're going to use the lift to get off the Sun World. You omitted that detail and spoke of Loki's devil fruit as a possible solution instead. So what Harridan says in the chapter that we've all read is that we need to get a lift up to the Sun Realm, which I initially read as very colloquial English, like, could you give me a lift somewhere? Mate, I need a lift. Stuff like that. But at the very least, looking at the early spoilers does seem to clarify this a bit by having Harridan saying, everyone get on the lift. But TLDR, it looks like they do have a way up, so we can safely continue to ignore the potential of Loki's devil fruit, and you know what? We're just going to use the lift to fight Emu. Emu's power makes everything before make no sense. If he can turn his enemies into slaves, why didn't he use it on every enemy? So that's definitely a question that's going to have to be answered at some point, and that is the danger of introducing such an extreme power like this. At the moment, there's no reason why you don't just use it on the entire planet, especially because St. Summers and St. Killingham confirm that they actually know this game and can even see the board. Killingham says that it's pretty much already completely covered in their color, so it's not even a one-time use power. Emu has done this before, and that is curious in and of itself. Here I was thinking that this was the first time in potentially centuries that Emu has had to set foot on the surface, but we have two, I guess relatively new, Holy Knights who are familiar with this game, so where else has it been played? And when was that where else? But Oda does have a fair bit of explaining to do. At the very least, we need a reason why, say 30 to 40 years ago, Emu didn't just snap it down for 5 minutes, and Domi Reversi Roger, which would have saved him a lot of trouble in the long run, or Rocks, or even Luffy once he started to become a bit of a pain. Or Kaido, or Big Mom, or Whitebeard, all of these colossal problems that the world government has failed to deal with. So there does need to be a limitation to this power somewhere, or a very good personality-based excuse why Emu doesn't just want to enslave everyone. Seeing Urashima's brother shows how into world building Oda is, and boy, was it unnecessary. So I thought that was a very fun touch. And I say that as a pretty big not fan of Urashima. This week in Yamato's cover story, we have a sumo tournament where Yamato defeats Urashima's older brother. And look, if you don't remember Urashima, he's the guy we met right at the beginning of Wano who wanted to marry Kiku. And it's also implied that he ate the household pet of an elderly couple. Great guy. So not only is Yamato doing the Kozuki Oden pilgrimage, but we're also starting to walk the path of Luffy as well. And Kawamatsu is on the cover watching the match in the audience, and I hope that this isn't all that we see of him. He is my favorite vassal after Raizo, and so I am always keen for more Kawamatsu. The horn Killingham toots is most likely meant to be the Gjallarhorn, the blowing of which signifies the beginning of Ragnarok, or thematically it's the Gjallarhorn anyway. So honestly, the first thing that I thought of when I saw this was the Horn of Gondor. But that's just because I have so much Lord of the Rings based brain rot. Thematically, I definitely agree though, as this horn is the item that is currently causing the closest possible thing to an apocalypse that we have seen in the One Piece world, as it just keeps summoning and reviving infinite nightmare demons. However, that does add a potential point of compromise, because if Killingham does need the horn to revive these creatures, then we just need to take that horn off him and we have completely changed the game. And as for its inspiration, I should say that as with all good Norse craft work, it's also been theorized by Norse scholars that the Gjallarhorn, in addition to heralding the end times, also served as a drinking vessel. The sharp teeth and thick eyelashes on St. Killingham are features that appear on Charlotte Gillette and Charlotte Poir from the Big Mom Pirates, so he is probably from their race. So Charlotte Gillette and Charlotte Poir are twin sisters. The one that casual readers and watchers will be more familiar with is Gillette. She had the funky butterfruit, and she does have those rather luxurious St. Killingham eyelashes. However, her teeth are completely normal. But when we look at her twin sister Poir, seen here speaking to a frogman, which I don't think has ever been addressed, I guess he's some sort of frogzoan, or a homie, maybe a homie. But Poir does have spiky teeth, however, she lacks the eyebrows. So both of them do have parts of Killingham. However, something weirder about Charlotte Gillette in particular is that she has what could very well be devil horns, and somehow she's not even the most demonic of the Charlotte siblings. That would be 24th son Charlotte Dacroix, who flat out has demon wings, but these could also be devil fruit related, like how Stussy's bat fruit gives her very similar looking wings, whilst retaining all other aspects of humanity. I don't want to be a downer, then don't, but you're gonna do it anyway, aren't you? But at this point, I think it's entirely possible that our heroes fail, Emu gets what they want out of Elbaf, and the Straw Hats are forced to retreat with what little they can salvage. Likely Harudin and his crew, and injured Loki and Gaban, Bonnie Lilith, and maybe Ripley and or Colin. Alright, so I'm in two very different minds about this. Part of me does think that Emu shouldn't be defeated here, even if it's not actual Emu, but a fraction of the power being channeled through Gunko, because any defeat is ultimately going to diminish the threat of Emu going forward. Like when Kang the Conqueror was introduced and also beaten in Ant-Man. It just feels like a bad idea to have such an overwhelming presence, someone who we are relying on to be our main major antagonist beaten in their debut appearance. And then there's also the Giants. The Giants of Elbaf have been flagged as one of the deciding factors of the incoming war, a pretty major deciding factor. So if we do save them here and they all align with Luffy, then we are going into that war in a very unexciting way in terms of drama, because we know that we already have the deciding factor on our side. Whereas if Emu did successfully keep all of the Giants converted, then we would be doing the classic One Piece thing of going into a situation as the distinct underdogs, having to overcome great adversity and stuff like that. Emu keeping the Giants would be a great way to achieve that darkest before dawn kind of feeling, as there will need to come a time in the future where it feels like all is lost before all is won, and this could be a step towards that. However, my One Piece intuition is relentlessly nagging me and reminding me to think of the children on Elbaf, and how this story is more about them and building hope for the future than it is to create despair for the final conflict. In this chapter, we even see how the nightmare creatures are made. We see all of the children dreaming about devils, and then devils spawn from the Nightmare Fisher. And I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that the fate of Elbaf hinges almost entirely on these kids. We now know that their thoughts can be manipulated even while they're unconscious, and I find it very, very difficult to see Oda passing up the opportunity to flip this dynamic and have the kids start to dream about warriors of hope to come and save them after being influenced by the arrival of Luffy, Loki, and of course, Bent's mum. Maybe even Colin manages to conjure a dream version of Scopogaban. To me, that feels like Oda's focus and direction. That we've got to go out and win the hearts and minds of the next generation, and it's their will and their desires that are going to safeguard and shape the future. Which would be a complete defeat for Emu without necessarily physically punching him up. Emu's goal, as stated in this chapter, is to shatter the spirit of Elbaf, and he thinks he's doing that by corrupting the adults and removing the older generation. Because Emu and the Holy Knights only see value in raw strength. The adults can fight, the kids can't. Therefore, the adults have the spirit and the kids have the not that. But the hubris here is that through St. Killingham, Emu has actually given the younger generation the exact tools they need to win this fight, because as long as they believe hard enough in salvation and in the spirit of their culture, that will manifest into reality, and all of the nightmare creatures are going to be reversied into dream creatures. That is where I think we're heading, but you let me know how you think this is all going to play out in the comments below.